Imagine lying on your own kitchen floor at 1 in the morning, bleeding out from a stab wound, while your stepbrother stands over you with the knife. Imagine your own parents telling the police you were just being a dramatic liar. Imagine your mother laughing in a courtroom, whispering that no one would ever believe you. But then the judge pressed play on a recording she did not know existed, and the entire room went completely silent. The truth always leaves a mark, and this is the story of how I made sure they could never wash it away. My name is Caleb. I am 32 years old, and I work as a financial auditor. I do not have a long, rambling backstory to share with you. I am just a man who worked hard, played by the rules, and loved his family unconditionally. I live in a quiet, manicured suburb of Portland, Oregon. It is the kind of neighborhood where people water their lawns on Sunday mornings and wave to the mail carrier. But there was nothing quiet or normal about the night my entire reality was shattered. Let me take you right into the center of the nightmare. It was exactly 1 in the morning. I was pressed hard against the cold hardwood floor of my own kitchen. My hands were clamped tightly over my lower right side, but it was no use. The thick, warm blood was already slipping through my fingers, soaking through my shirt, and pooling rapidly on the polished wood. The pain was blinding. It was a sharp, white, hot fire that radiated through my chest and made it completely impossible to draw a full breath. Standing directly above me was my 30-year-old stepbrother, Wyatt. He was breathing heavily, swaying slightly on his feet. The suffocating smell of cheap bourbon rolled off him in heavy waves, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of my own blood. In his right hand, he held a 6-inch paring knife that he had just pulled from my butcher block. The steel blade was dripping onto my clean floor. I looked up into his eyes, searching for some sign of panic, some hint of remorse or realization of what he had just done. There was absolutely nothing. He did not look horrified. He looked annoyed. Just 20 minutes before this violent nightmare, the house had been perfectly still. I had been sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a stack of freshly printed financial statements under the harsh glow of the pendant lights. I am an auditor. My entire career is built on finding anomalies. I track missing numbers. I hunt down the lies that people try to hide in the deep rows of a spreadsheet. For weeks, I had been conducting a routine review of the family trust accounts. This was a fund set up by my late biological father, designed to secure my future and provide a financial safety net for our household. I had paid the mortgage on this house for 7 years. I had done the accounting for my stepdad's business for free, acting out of a desperate absolute trust and a yearning for my mother's love. I had given this family everything I had to give, but as I dug into the records, I noticed aggressive, unexplained withdrawals. Thousands of dollars were bleeding out of the trust accounts month after month. It took me less than 2 days of intense tracking to follow the digital footprints. The trail led right back to Wyatt. He had been forging my signature and routing the trust money to offshore accounts to cover his massive gambling debts and his reckless, destructive lifestyle. He was stealing my future, dollar by dollar, right under my nose. When I heard Wyatt stumbling through the front door at midnight, bringing the stench of a dive bar into my clean house, I did not wait for the morning to speak with him. I confronted him right there in the kitchen. I laid the highlighted bank statements on the granite counter. I pointed directly to the forged routing numbers and the fake authorizations. I expected him to break down. I thought he would cry or beg for mercy, or at least try to invent a pathetic lie to save himself. I had trusted him. I had treated him like real blood. Instead, Wyatt just stared at the papers. He let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He looked me dead in the eye, totally devoid of guilt, and turned toward the knife block on the counter. He grabbed the paring knife and lunged at me before my brain could even process the threat. He drove the blade right into my side, twisting his wrist with a sickening crunch. The sheer, unexpected force of the attack knocked me backward. I hit the floor hard, the breath leaving my lungs in a violent rush. Now I was lying there, gasping for air, my vision starting to blur at the edges. Wyatt stood over me casually, wiping a smear of my blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. He looked down at me with absolute contempt. He leaned in close and told me I was pathetic. He said that no one was going to care about a few missing dollars from a trust fund. He promised me that if I opened my mouth to the police, he would make sure his next cut was fatal. The edges of the kitchen turned black. I tried to scream for help, but all that came out of my throat was a wet, choking sound. I fully expected to die right there on the floor of the house I worked so hard to pay for, murdered by the man I grew up with. But the real betrayal had not even started yet. The worst part was not the burning agony of the knife wound in my side. The worst part was hearing the heavy footsteps rushing down the wooden stairs. My mother and my stepdad had finally woken up from the commotion. Help was coming, or so I foolishly thought. I had absolutely no idea that the people who were supposed to protect me were about to do something far more twisted and cruel than driving a blade into my flesh. I could hear the familiar creak of the floorboards above me. The heavy, hurried footsteps pounding down the oak staircase sounded like absolute salvation. My mind, clouded by the agonizing pain in my side, clung to a desperate hope. My mother is coming. My stepdad is coming. I am saved. They will see what Wyatt did. They will call an ambulance. And they will hold my hand while we wait for the police to arrive. I forced my eyes to stay open, fighting the overwhelming urge to let the darkness swallow me completely. Robert and Susan burst into the kitchen. Susan was hurriedly tying the belt of her silk robe, her face pale in the harsh kitchen lighting. Robert was barefoot, his eyes darting wildly around the room. For a fraction of a second, the scene must have looked like a nightmare to them. Their eldest son standing there, gripping a bloody knife, their youngest son bleeding out on the expensive hardwood floor. I expected my mother to scream. I expected her to drop to her knees, to press her hands frantically against my wound, to cry out my name in terror. I expected Robert to tackle Wyatt to the ground, to disarm him, to immediately dial for emergency services. What actually unfolded before my eyes defied every natural instinct of parental love and human decency. Susan stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at the massive pool of blood spreading beneath me. She looked at Wyatt, who was still swaying slightly, staring blankly at the weapon in his hand. She did not look at me, not even for a second. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not panicked or terrified. It was sharp, cold, and entirely calculating. It was the voice of a manager handling a messy inconvenience. "Robert, get the knife," she commanded. Robert stepped carefully over my legs. He did not ask if I was breathing. He did not ask if I was going to survive. He simply reached out and pried the paring knife from Wyatt's trembling fingers. Susan snatched a clean dish towel from the kitchen counter. She took the weapon from her husband and wiped the handle with quick, furious, deliberate motions. She was erasing Wyatt's fingerprints. She was destroying the evidence of my attempted murder right in front of my fading eyes. Then she tossed the knife into the stainless steel sink and turned on the hot water, washing away the remaining blood. I lay there, choking on my own fluids, entirely paralyzed by the surreal horror of the moment. Susan then grabbed a heavy, thick crystal vase from the center of the dining table. It was a beautiful vase, a gift I had purchased for her for Mother's Day just 3 years ago, when I still believed my efforts could earn her affection. Without a moment of hesitation, she smashed the crystal violently against the sharp granite edge of the kitchen island. Thick, jagged shards of glass rained down around me, scattering across the floor and mixing directly into the pool of my blood. She grabbed Wyatt by the shoulders and shook him hard. "Listen to me right now," she whispered aggressively, her face inches from his. "You were asleep upstairs. You heard a loud crash in the kitchen. You came down and found him like this. Do you understand me? He fell." Wyatt nodded numbly, his drunken eyes wide with sudden clarity. Only after the scene was perfectly staged did Robert pull his cell phone from his pocket and finally dial emergency services. I desperately tried to speak. I tried to scream that my own stepbrother had just stabbed me, that my parents were staging a cover-up, that they were monsters. But when I forced my mouth open, only a wet, sickening, gurgling sound escaped my lips. The blade had plunged deep into my side and punctured my lung. Every single attempt to draw a breath felt like swallowing broken glass. I was physically drowning in my own body, trapped in a silent prison of agony. Susan finally knelt beside me on the floor, but there was no warmth in her eyes. She leaned in close, her face a mask of stone. "Do not ruin your brother's life over this, Caleb," she hissed directly into my ear. "He made a mistake. You're going to be fine. Do not say a single word to anyone." The high-pitched wail of sirens soon pierced the quiet suburban night. Flashing red and blue lights swept frantically across the kitchen windows, casting long, chaotic shadows against the walls. Heavy boots pounded rapidly up the front porch steps. When the police officers and paramedics burst through the front door, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was like watching a masterclass in theatrical performance. Susan threw herself dramatically over my body, sobbing hysterically. Her tears flowed freely. She stroked my hair, wailing my name aloud, begging the paramedics to please hurry and save her precious baby. An officer with a notepad stepped toward her, gently pulling her back by the shoulders so the medical team could cut away my ruined shirt and work on my chest. Ma'am tried to stay calm. Can you tell us exactly what happened here? He asked softly, his pen ready. Susan buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed manufactured sobs. She looked up at the officer with wide, tear-filled eyes. Officer, my son was incredibly drunk. She cried out, her voice cracking with fake grief. He tripped and fell hard into that broken glass vase. He always loves to be dramatic and blow things out of proportion just for attention. Please, you have to save him. I lay there on the cold, sticky hardwood as a rushing paramedic strapped an oxygen mask tightly over my face. I was entirely stripped of my voice, rendered totally mute by the collapsed lung and the crushing pain. I could only stare up at the ceiling as the heavy, suffocating weight of my mother's ultimate betrayal crushed whatever was left of my spirit. I was bleeding out on her floor, fighting for every single agonizing gasp of air, and she was looking a police officer right in the eye, selling my life away to protect an attempted murderer. She called me a dramatic liar, while my own blood literally stained her hands. Robert stood quietly in the corner, nodding along with her fabricated story, playing the part of the shocked and worried stepfather. Wyatt sat slumped on the bottom step of the staircase, holding his head in his hands, playing the deeply traumatized brother. They had formed an impenetrable, unified wall of deception. As the paramedics hoisted my limp body onto a stretcher and wheeled me out of my own home, out the front door, and into the flashing lights of the ambulance, I locked eyes with Susan one last time. She was no longer crying. Her face was set and cold. She had made her choice, and it was not me. The first thing I registered was the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. It was a cold, mechanical sound that seemed to echo inside my own skull. I tried to take a deep breath, but a sharp, blinding agony ripped through my right side, forcing me to stop short. The memory of the kitchen floor, the blood and the blade all came rushing back in a terrifying wave. I forced my heavy eyelids open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit at Providence Hospital stung my eyes. I was hooked up to a tangle of intravenous lines and monitors. My mouth was bone dry and my throat felt like it had been scraped with sandpaper from the breathing tube they must have just recently removed. I slowly turned my head, fighting the stiff ache in my neck, and looked around the small hospital room. I expected to see a chair pulled up right next to my bed. I expected to see my mother sitting there, her face stained with tears, holding my hand and telling me how sorry she was for the horrible misunderstanding. I expected Robert to be pacing the floor looking worried, but the room was completely empty. There was no one. Not a single family member had bothered to stay. The people who brought me into this world, the people I had supported and protected, had sent me off in the back of an ambulance and simply gone back to sleep. I was entirely alone. A gentle nurse walked in a few minutes later to check my vitals. She offered me a small cup of ice chips and spoke to me in that soft, pitying tone reserved for patients who have no visitors. She placed a clear plastic bag of my personal belongings on the rolling table beside my bed. Inside, I could see my wallet, my keys, and my cell phone. The screen of my phone suddenly lit up, illuminating the plastic bag in the dimly lit room. It buzzed once, then it buzzed again, and then a third time in rapid succession. Despite the agonizing pain radiating from my punctured lung, I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the phone from the bag. I thought perhaps they were text messages from my mother checking to see if I had survived the surgery. I unlocked the screen with my thumbprint. They were not text messages from my family. They were automated security alerts from my primary bank. The bold red text on the screen made my blood run absolutely cold. Multiple failed login attempts detected. Suspicious activity reported. Account freeze initiated pending identity verification. Someone was actively trying to hack into my personal checking and savings accounts. I opened my email application and my inbox was flooded with notifications. There were password reset requests for my investment portfolios, my retirement accounts, and my business audit software. Someone was systematically trying to lock me out of my own financial life. It did not take a financial auditor to figure out exactly who was behind this coordinated attack. It was Susan and Robert. They knew I had survived the night. They knew that as soon as I could speak, I would tell the authorities exactly what Wyatt had done to me and exactly how they had covered it up. They were terrified. But instead of feeling remorse, they were moving to cut off my lifelines. They were trying to drain my accounts and freeze my assets so that I would have absolutely no money to hire a lawyer, pay my medical bills, or fight back against their fabricated police report. They wanted to leave me completely destitute and powerless, lying in that sterile hospital bed staring at the digital proof of their financial ambush. The last remaining shred of love I had for my mother withered and died. It was replaced by a profound, sickening realization of how thoroughly I had been used. For 7 long years, I had been the absolute pillar of that family. When Robert drove his contracting business into the ground through sheer incompetence and laziness, I was the one who stepped in. I spent countless weekends and late nights balancing his ledgers, filing his corporate taxes, and rescuing his company from bankruptcy. I never charged him a single dime for thousands of hours of highly specialized accounting work. When the bank threatened to foreclose on their beautiful suburban home 5 years ago, I was the one who drained my own hard-earned savings to catch up on their arrears. Since that day, I had been paying their $3,000 monthly mortgage without fail. I paid for the roof over the very kitchen where Wyatt stabbed me. I bought the groceries they ate. I funded the comfortable, middle-class illusion they paraded in front of their neighbors and their church congregation. I did it all because I suffered from a pathetic, desperate yearning for my mother's love. I was the child she always looked past, the son who was never quite funny enough, charming enough, or lovable enough compared to Wyatt. I mistakenly believed that if I made myself incredibly useful, if I solved all their problems and carried all their heavy burdens, they would finally see my inherent value. I thought I could purchase the unconditional affection that parents are supposed to give their children for free. But as I watched another banking alert flash across my phone screen, the ultimate truth crystallized in my mind. To Susan and Robert, I was never a son. I was an automated teller machine. I was an insurance policy. I was a disposable asset. And now that I had become a threat to their favorite child, they were trying to liquidate me entirely. They assumed I would simply roll over and accept defeat, just like I had always done whenever they demanded a sacrifice. They thought my silence and my compliance were guaranteed. They were incredibly wrong. The physical pain in my chest was blinding, but my mind had never been more clear. I carefully locked my phone and set it down on the bedside table. The tears that I thought I would cry for my mother never came. Instead, a cold, calculated calm washed over me. They wanted a financial war. They wanted to see what happened when you try to destroy the man who holds the keys to every single one of your financial secrets. They had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of them. The door to my hospital room swung open, breaking the sterile silence of the intensive care unit. A man in a wrinkled beige suit walked in holding a standard-issue police clipboard. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. He did not look like a man searching for the truth. He looked like a man at the end of a very long shift, simply looking to check a box and clear a file from his desk. He pulled a chair to the side of my bed and sat down with a heavy sigh. I braced myself for his questions. I was ready to push through the tearing agony in my chest to tell him about the stolen money, the confrontation, and the cold-blooded way Wyatt drove that paring knife into my side. I expected him to ask for my statement. Instead, he simply tapped his pen against his clipboard and offered me a sympathetic, patronizing smile. He told me I was very lucky to be alive. He said the human body is fragile and alcohol makes people clumsy. I stared at him, entirely unable to comprehend what he was saying. Detective Miller continued flipping to a new page on his clipboard. He casually explained that the police were officially closing the investigation into my injuries. He said that my mother and my stepfather had provided sworn recorded statements at the scene. According to their official police report, I had come home severely intoxicated. I had become belligerent, lost my balance, and crashed directly into a large crystal vase on the kitchen island. According to my own mother, Wyatt had heroically tried to catch me getting my blood all over his hands in the process. They painted a picture of a troubled, dramatic son who drank too much and caused a tragic household accident. The detective said the case was closed. There would be no criminal charges. He patted my leg, told me to take it easy on the drinking, and left a business card on my rolling table before walking out the door. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my chest burning with a rage so intense it felt completely uncontainable. They had done it. They had actually pulled it off. Susan and Robert had looked a police officer right in the eye and fabricated an entire reality to protect an attempted murderer, turning me into the villain of my own near-death experience. The sheer audacity of their lie was suffocating. I wanted to rip the intravenous lines from my arms, march down to the precinct, and scream the truth until someone listened. But my punctured lung kept me anchored to that hospital bed, weak and voiceless. Then, as I lay there plotting ways to make them pay, my professional instincts kicked in. I am a financial auditor. My entire life is governed by a strict adherence to documentation. I do not rely on assumptions, and I certainly never rely on blind trust. I track every receipt, I verify every transaction, I record everything. A sudden electric jolt of memory pierced through the haze of my pain medications. I closed my eyes and retraced my exact steps from the night before. I remembered sitting at the kitchen island, uncovering Wyatt's massive theft from the family trust. I remembered hearing his heavy footsteps stumbling through the front door. And I remembered exactly what I did right before I stood up to confront him. I knew Wyatt was a pathological liar. I knew he would deny taking the money. So before I had walked into the main kitchen area, I had reached into the pocket of my fleece jacket. I had unlocked my phone, opened the voice memo application, and pressed the bright red record button. I had dropped the phone right back into my pocket, leaving the microphone completely exposed. My heart began to hammer wildly against my ribs, triggering the alarms on the heart monitor beside my bed. The recording, the entire confrontation, the stabbing, and the immediate aftermath had to be on that audio file. A nurse rushed into the room to check the beeping monitor. She was a kind older woman with soft eyes. I grabbed her wrist with whatever strength I had left. I could barely speak above a raspy whisper, but I begged her to bring me the clear plastic bag containing my personal belongings. She looked hesitant, noting my elevated heart rate, but my absolute desperation must have convinced her. She walked over to the corner cabinet and returned with the plastic bag. I tore the bag open with shaking hands. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen was cracked in the corner, and the back casing was smeared with my own dried brown blood. My battery indicator showed only 3% life remaining. My hands were trembling violently as I pressed my thumb against the home button. The screen unlocked. I bypassed the voice memo app on the local hard drive. If my phone died now, I needed to know the file was safe. I went straight to my cloud storage drive, praying to a god I had not spoken to in years, that the autosync feature had engaged while I was connected to my home wireless network. I watched the small circular loading icon spin on the screen. It felt like time had completely stopped. Every single second stretched into an eternity of waiting. Then the folder refreshed. Right at the very top of the list was an audio file. The timestamp was from the night before beginning at exactly 12:48 in the morning. The file length was 14 minutes and 22 seconds. I did not even have the breath to sigh in relief, but I tapped the file and pressed play. I held the phone speaker tightly against my ear. Through the faint background static of rustling fabric, I heard my own voice clear and steady, asking Wyatt why he had forged my signature on the trust documents. I heard his drunken, arrogant laugh. I heard his slurred voice threatening my life. I heard the unmistakable, terrifying sound of the blade tearing into me and my own choked gasp as I fell. But more importantly, I heard what came next. Clear as crystal, preserved in pristine digital audio, I heard Susan and Robert rushing downstairs. I heard my mother ordering Robert to wipe my blood off the knife handle. I heard her telling Wyatt to smash the crystal vase to create a cover story. Every single word of their conspiracy, every ounce of their cold-blooded betrayal was recorded in absolute perfection. I paused the audio and locked the phone. I let my head sink back into the hospital pillows. A profound, terrifying calm washed over me, completely replacing the helpless rage from moments before. The police believed I was a drunken fool. My family believed they had successfully silenced me and secured their stolen wealth. They thought they had buried the truth under a mountain of sworn lies. They had absolutely no idea that I was holding an ironclad confession directly in the palm of my bloody hand. The time for being the good sacrificial son was completely over. The time for total financial and legal destruction had just begun. I lay in the hospital bed, listening to the steady hum of the machinery. My phone battery was at 3%. I pushed the call button and asked the kind night nurse if she had a spare charging cable. She brought me one from the break room and plugged it into the wall behind my bed. As the battery icon turned green, I knew exactly what I had to do next. The audio recording proved that my mother and stepfather were willing to cover up my attempted murder, but it did not explain the depth of their depravity. Why would a mother go to such extreme lengths to protect a stepson over her own biological child? The answer is always the same. As a financial auditor, I know that when human behavior stops making sense, you simply have to follow the money. Despite the agonizing pain in my chest, I propped myself up against the pillows. I connected to the hospital wireless network and opened my secure browser. I navigated directly to the portal for the family trust. This was a specific account set up by my late biological father when I was just a boy. I had worked grueling hours at a manufacturing plant to build that fund before cancer took him away from us. It was his final gift to me. It was meant to be my safety net for the future, a foundation for a life he would never get to see me live. I had never touched a single dime of it. I had been saving it, letting the compound interest grow while I worked my way up the corporate ladder. The balance should have been sitting at well over $400,000. I entered my credentials and answered the security prompts. The dashboard loaded on my small screen. I stared at the bold black numbers, entirely unable to process what I was seeing. The balance was not $400,000. The balance was just under $12,000. $350,000 had been completely drained from my biological father's trust. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard as I pulled up the transaction history. The money had not disappeared all at once. It had been bleeding out in massive aggressive chunks over the past 8 months. I downloaded the cancelled checks and wire transfer authorizations. When I zoomed in on the signature lines, my stomach violently churned. My name was signed at the bottom of every single document, but the handwriting was a clumsy, rushed forgery. The loops were wrong. The pressure was uneven. It was an amateur attempt, but it had been enough to fool the automated banking systems. I traced the destination of the wire transfers. The digital footprint was incredibly sloppy. The funds had been routed directly into offshore holding accounts and domestic wire services that were explicitly linked to well-known online sports betting platforms and Las Vegas casinos. It was Wyatt. He had always had a gambling problem, a reckless addiction that my mother constantly made excuses for. But I never imagined his addiction had escalated to the point of a 6-figure federal crime. He had stolen my entire future to chase a jackpot he was never going to win. That was exactly why he had panicked and stabbed me in the kitchen. I had found the initial discrepancies. I was getting too close to the truth, and he knew I would eventually uncover the massive scope of his theft. He tried to kill me to silence the auditor, but that still left one massive glaring question burning in my mind. How did Wyatt manage to steal $350,000 without Robert and Susan noticing? The trust required dual notification for any withdrawal over $10,000. The alert emails would have gone directly to Susan as the original custodian of the account. She had to have known. I opened a new tab and accessed the joint checking account I managed for Robert's contracting business. I had all their passwords because I had been doing their accounting for free for 7 years. I cross-referenced the dates of Wyatt's massive withdrawals from my trust fund with the deposit logs in Robert and Susan's personal accounts. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the horrifying truth. 2 days after Wyatt forged a withdrawal for $80,000 from my trust, a cashier's check for $65,000 was deposited directly into Robert and Susan's joint account. The very next afternoon, that exact amount was wired to a luxury car dealership in downtown Portland. That was the exact same day my mother drove home in a brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV. She had paraded that vehicle up and down the street, boasting to the neighbors about Robert's booming business. Robert's business was failing. I knew that better than anyone because I balanced his miserable ledgers every single month. They did not buy that car with hard-earned money. They bought it with the money Wyatt stole from my dead father. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow far more devastating than the knife wound in my side. My mother did not just turn a blind eye to her stepson stealing my inheritance. She was an active, willing participant in the crime. Wyatt had bought her silence. He had paid off my mother and his father with a luxury vehicle purchased with my stolen money. They had allowed him to drain my safety net because they were directly profiting from the theft. That was the real reason Susan wiped my blood off the knife handle. That was the real reason she smashed the crystal vase and lied to the police. She was not just protecting Wyatt from a violent assault charge. She was protecting herself from a massive federal fraud indictment. If the police investigated the stabbing, they would inevitably uncover the financial motive. They would find the forged checks. They would trace the money to the casino and to the dealership. My mother sold my life to a police officer for the exact same reason she sold my future. She did it to protect her own comfortable, greedy, deceptive existence. I locked my phone and set it carefully on the rolling table. I was no longer a grieving son looking for his mother's love. I was an auditor who had just uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy. They had taken my money. They had tried to take my life. And now, armed with the audio recording and the digital paper trail, I was going to take absolutely everything from them. I just had to wait for the perfect moment to strike. I had no idea that they were already planning their next move to destroy me, completely unaware of the trap I was about to set. 2 days later, my attending physician finally cleared me for medical discharge. The physical pain in my side was a constant burning ache. Every time I took a shallow breath, the fresh stitches pulling my flesh together sent a sharp warning through my nervous system. I was still weak and moving slowly, but my mind was completely consumed by the digital evidence sitting safely in my cloud storage. I had the audio recording of my attempted murder. I had the bank statements proving my stepbrother stole $350,000. I had the exact wire transfers showing my mother and stepdad buying a luxury vehicle with my stolen inheritance. I was packing my few personal belongings into a clear plastic hospital bag, fully prepared to walk straight into a police precinct and burn their perfect suburban facade to the ground. I never made it out of the hospital room. Just as I was putting on a cheap pair of paper scrub pants the hospital had provided because my clothes had been ruined by my own blood, a man walked through the door. He was not a doctor or a nurse. He wore a cheap grey suit and carried a thick manila envelope. He asked if my name was Caleb. When I nodded, he stepped forward, tapped the heavy envelope against my chest, and told me I was officially served. He turned on his heel and walked out without another word. I stood there, in the sterile hospital room, my heart hammering a dangerous rhythm against my wounded ribs. I pulled the thick stack of legal documents from the envelope. The bold black letters at the top of the first page made my blood run absolutely cold. It was an emergency ex parte restraining order issued by the Multnomah County Circuit Court. The petitioners listed on the document were Susan and Robert. The respondent was me. I lowered myself slowly onto the edge of the hospital bed, completely ignoring the shooting pain in my side. I read through the sworn affidavits attached to the court order. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. My mother had looked a judge in the eye and spun a fabricated tale of sheer terror. In her sworn statement, she claimed that I had been exhibiting severe mental instability for months. She wrote that I had developed a violent, unprovoked jealousy toward my stepbrother Wyatt. According to her official legal declaration, I had come home in a drunken rage, smashed a crystal vase to create a weapon and cornered Wyatt in the kitchen. She swore under penalty of perjury that I had slipped and fallen on the glass during my own violent rampage, and that they were now entirely terrified for their lives. Robert had provided a corroborating statement echoing every single one of her vicious lies. They painted a horrific, vivid picture of a deeply disturbed, dangerous man who needed to be kept away from their peaceful family at all costs. The judge had believed them completely. Based on their emotional performance, the court had granted an immediate order of protection. I flipped to the second page of the judge's ruling, and the true cruelty of their plan hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The legal order explicitly mandated that I maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from the petitioners and their primary residence at all times. It listed the exact street address of the house in the suburbs. That was the house I had saved from foreclosure. That was the house where I had paid the $3,000 mortgage every single month for 7 years straight. The mortgage was paid from my bank account, but because I had trusted my family unconditionally, the deed to the property was still solely in Robert and Susan's names. By filing this fraudulent restraining order, they had completely and legally barred me from stepping foot on my own property. They had locked me out of the house I was paying for. I looked down at myself. I was wearing hospital-issued paper clothing. My wallet and my cracked cell phone were sitting in a clear plastic bag. My car keys were still sitting on the kitchen counter at the house I was now legally forbidden to approach. My bank accounts were currently locked in a frozen dispute because of their previous attempts to hack my passwords. I had absolutely no money, no clothes, no car, and no home. With one single stack of legal papers, the people who were supposed to love me had rendered me completely destitute and homeless while I was still bleeding from their violence. A hospital security guard entered my room a few minutes later. He looked at the legal papers in my hand with a tight, sympathetic expression and told me that because I was officially discharged, I had to vacate the premises. I gathered my plastic bag and walked slowly down the long fluorescent hallway. Every step was an absolute agony. I pushed through the automatic sliding doors and stood on the concrete curb outside Providence Hospital. The cold, damp Portland wind cut right through my thin paper shirt, making me shiver violently. I watched the cars passing by on the street, completely isolated from the rest of the world. My mother had assumed this would break me. She assumed that, by stripping me of my home, my money, and my reputation, I would simply crawl away into the shadows and disappear forever. She thought I would be too exhausted and too humiliated to fight back against a court order. But she had fundamentally misunderstood the way an auditor's mind works. I did not feel defeated as I stood freezing on that concrete curb. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. By filing that restraining order, my mother and Robert had not just told a lie to a police officer in the chaotic aftermath of a crime. They had officially filed a sworn affidavit with a court of law. They had documented their fabricated story under the strict penalty of perjury. They had handed me the exact legal rope they would eventually hang from. I gripped my plastic bag tightly, ignoring the burning in my chest. I did not need my house right now. I did not need my car. I only needed my cracked cell phone and the 14-minute audio recording waiting safely in my cloud storage. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of legal paperwork. They had no idea I was about to use those very same papers to completely obliterate their entire existence. I took a deep, painful breath of the cold air and started walking down the street, ready to find the legal firepower I needed to begin the war. I did not stay on that freezing concrete curb for long. The cold wind blowing off the Willamette River was biting, but it only sharpened my focus. My mother and Robert thought they had completely paralyzed me. They assumed that a man with a punctured lung, no access to his bank accounts, and a fraudulent restraining order keeping him from his own home would simply crawl into a corner and give up. They severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I am a financial auditor. I spend my entire life tracking down liars and dismantling their carefully constructed illusions. I do not break, I build cases. My first stop was a cheap discount clothing store downtown. I used a small amount of emergency cash I always kept folded behind my driver license to buy a basic gray sweatsuit and a cheap pair of sneakers. I changed in the store restroom, carefully avoiding the fresh, agonizing stitches pulling at my side. Every time I raised my arm, a white-hot fire shot through my chest. But I pushed the pain down. I had work to do. Next, I walked to a public library. I sat down at one of their public computers and logged into my secure cloud storage. For 2 hours, I worked in total silence. I downloaded every single bank statement from the family trust. I printed the records showing the $350,000 that Wyatt had drained to pay his gambling debts. I printed the wire transfer logs proving that Robert and Susan had received $65,000 of my stolen money and immediately sent it to a luxury car dealership in downtown Portland. I laid the papers out on the small wooden desk, organizing them chronologically. It was a flawless, undeniable paper trail of grand larceny and fraud. Finally, I downloaded the 14-minute audio recording from my phone and saved it onto 3 separate flash drives that I purchased from a corner pharmacy. My ammunition was gathered. Now I needed someone to help me fire the weapon. I needed an attorney, but I did not need a friendly family lawyer who would try to negotiate a polite settlement. I needed a predator. I needed someone who understood exactly how to dismantle a toxic family in a courtroom without showing an ounce of mercy. That is why I walked straight to the downtown Portland offices of Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a ruthless, highly respected civil and criminal litigator. I had heard her name years ago when I was doing audit work for a corporate client who had faced her in court. My client had described her as an absolute shark in a tailored suit. She was famous for destroying fraudulent claims and tearing apart witnesses who dared to lie under oath. She was exactly what I needed. The receptionist at the front desk of her high-rise office looked at me with clear hesitation. I was wearing baggy sweatpants. My posture was hunched from the stab wound, and I looked completely exhausted. I did not look like a man who could afford a high-powered litigator. But I placed my thick manila folder on the polished glass desk and politely demanded 10 minutes of her time. I told the receptionist that I had a case involving a 6-figure financial fraud, a staged crime scene, and a documented cover-up. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Sarah Jenkins. Her office was immaculate, lined with thick law books and offering a commanding view of the city skyline. Sarah sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately assessed every detail about me. She did not offer me a warm, comforting smile. She simply asked me to explain why I was in her office. I did not waste her time with emotional complaints about my childhood. I did not cry about how my mother had never loved me. I opened my manila folder and slid the stack of financial documents across her desk. I explained the trust fund. I pointed out the forged signatures. I showed her the exact routing numbers that linked my stolen inheritance to her luxury sports utility vehicle. I laid out the timeline of the theft with the cold clinical precision of a professional auditor. Sarah picked up the documents. She studied the highlighted bank statements and the wire transfers. Her expression remained perfectly neutral, but I could see the gears turning in her mind as she verified the undeniable connection between the stolen trust money and the car dealership. "This is compelling financial evidence, Caleb," she said slowly, tapping her pen against the desk. "But you are facing a severe uphill battle. Your parents have filed a sworn police report and a legal restraining order claiming you were the violent aggressor. They have painted a picture of a mentally unstable man who fell on a broken vase. Without physical proof to contradict their official statements, a judge might view these financial documents as the desperate retaliation of an estranged, angry son." I looked her directly in the eye. I reached into my pocket and pulled out one of the small flash drives. I placed it gently on the center of her mahogany desk. "I know Wyatt is a pathological liar," I said quietly. "So right before I went downstairs to confront him about the missing $350,000, I started a voice recording on my cell phone. The phone was in my pocket the entire time. It recorded Wyatt threatening to kill me to cover up the theft. It recorded the sound of him driving a paring knife into my side. And it recorded my mother wiping my blood off the weapon, ordering my stepbrother to smash a vase, and explicitly planning the entire cover-up story they later fed to the police." Sarah stopped tapping her pen. The professional neutrality on her face vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. She took the flash drive, plugged it into her laptop, and pressed play. For 14 minutes, we sat in absolute silence in that high-rise office. The audio filled the room, Wyatt's drunken threats, the sickening sound of the attack, my gasps for air, and then the cold, calculating voice of my mother instructing her family on exactly how to frame me for my own attempted murder. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the office was incredibly heavy. Sarah stared at the computer screen for a long moment. Then she looked up at me. The sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes was unmistakable. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, her voice dropping to a low, powerful register. "Caleb," she said, a small, dangerous smile forming on her lips. "We are not just suing for assault. We are going after grand larceny, perjury, and obstruction of justice." Sarah did not waste a single second. Once she heard that audio recording, she transformed from a consulting attorney into an absolute weapon. She explained that if Susan and Robert realized I was building a legal case, they would immediately start shifting the stolen trust money. They would drain their joint accounts, transfer the stolen funds offshore, or hide cash under different corporate names. We needed to cut off their oxygen supply before they even knew they were in a fight. Sarah drafted an emergency federal injunction that very afternoon. Since my stolen trust money had crossed state lines into online betting platforms before being funneled back to purchase their luxury vehicle, the crime fell under federal jurisdiction. She filed for an immediate freeze on all of Robert and Susan's financial assets. Every checking account, every savings account, and every line of credit tied to their social security numbers was completely locked down. But Sarah did not stop there. Because they had fraudulently taken the stolen money and injected it directly into their lifestyle, Sarah placed a massive legal lien on their suburban house. This was the very same house they had just legally banned me from entering. They could not sell it. They could not refinance it. They could not take out a secondary mortgage to hire a defense attorney. They were trapped inside a financial cage of their own making, and the lock had just clicked shut. The legal process took 48 hours to execute fully across all the banking institutions. During that time, I stayed in a cheap, incredibly basic motel room that Sarah had arranged for me. I was recovering from my punctured lung and surviving on lukewarm canned soup and bottled water. Every time I took a deep breath, the stitches in my side burned with a sharp, blinding heat. It was a constant physical reminder of my family and their ultimate betrayal. But the physical pain was entirely overshadowed by the cold, quiet anticipation building in my chest. I knew my mother and her habits better than anyone. I knew Robert and his routines. Every Friday night, like clockwork, they dressed up and went out for a lavish dinner at a high-end steakhouse in the Pearl District. It was their weekly ritual to show off their manufactured wealth, to drink expensive wine, and to pretend they were the absolute picture of upper-middle-class success. I knew without a shadow of a doubt they would be there that Friday. They had just secured a fraudulent restraining order against their son. They believed Wyatt was completely safe from criminal prosecution. They thought they had perfectly executed the crime of a lifetime and gotten away with a massive fortune. They were going out to celebrate my permanent removal from their lives. Because I still had the login credentials to their primary credit card portal from my 7 years of doing their free accounting. I opened my laptop on the small scratched desk in my motel room and watched the pending transactions page in real time. At exactly 7:30 in the evening, a small authorization charge appeared on the screen for valid parking at the steakhouse. They had arrived. I could perfectly picture my mother stepping out of her newly purchased luxury sports utility vehicle wearing her favorite silk blouse, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering directly above her head. For 2 hours, I sat alone in the dim light of my room, staring intently at the glowing screen. I imagined them ordering the most expensive cuts of meat and toasting to their brilliant deception. Then, at exactly 9:45, the final bill was processed. The restaurant attempted to run a charge for $380. The computer screen refreshed. The transaction status flashed in bright red letters, declined. I watched with bated breath as the restaurant system attempted to run the card a second time. Declined again. A minute later, a completely different card number appeared on the screen, presumably Robert pulling his emergency backup credit card from his leather wallet in a mild panic. The status updated immediately. Declined, account frozen. I could easily visualize the exact scene unfolding in that upscale dining room. The polite but firm waiter handing the leather booklet back to Robert. The quiet murmurs and sideways glances of the surrounding tables. Susan face flushing bright red with absolute mortification as she realized they had absolutely no way to pay for their expensive steaks and vintage wine. She was a woman who built her entire identity on suburban prestige and outward appearances. Being publicly humiliated as a financial fraud in front of the local elite would feel like a literal death sentence to her pride. I knew Robert was probably scrambling, logging into his mobile banking application on his phone right there at the dinner table, only to find every single account balance displaying as restricted or locked by a federal order. The sheer panic must have been completely suffocating. They were stranded. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. They had covered up a violent attempted murder, and now they could not even afford to buy a single glass of water. I closed my laptop and leaned back against the cheap motel headboard. A deep, steady sense of peace washed over my exhausted body. For my entire life, I had been the designated scapegoat. I had been the punching bag, the free labor, the invisible sun who absorbed all their damage so they could shine. But not anymore. As I sat there in the quiet dark, nursing the stab wound my own brother gave me, I knew my mother was standing in a restaurant lobby, completely humiliated, entirely unaware that the son she had thrown away like garbage was the one pulling every single string from the shadows. The invisible financial trap was perfectly set, and they had just walked right into it. The morning of the legal deposition arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down heavily on the city skyline. I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor of the opposing counsel luxury law firm alongside my attorney, Sarah Jenkins. Sarah looked like a predator perfectly at ease in her natural hunting ground. I was wearing a sharp navy suit paid for by a small personal loan Sarah had facilitated for me after my accounts were compromised. My right side still throbbed with a burning agony every single time I took a breath. The fresh stitches from the stab wound pulled tightly against my skin, serving as a constant physical reminder of my family and their ultimate betrayal. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, burning focus entirely consuming my mind. Today was the day they would formally dig their own graves. Today, they would sit in a room with official court reporters and swear under the strict penalty of perjury to the massive web of lies they had so carefully constructed. We stepped into a massive glass-walled conference room that reeked of expensive leather and corporate intimidation. The opposing counsel was a slick, overpriced defense attorney named Vance, who wore a watch that likely cost more than my first vehicle. Sitting across the long, polished mahogany table was the family I had completely dedicated my entire adult life to supporting. My mother, Susan, my stepfather, Robert, and my stepbrother, Wyatt. They looked up as we entered the room. There was no shame in their eyes. There was no hesitation, and certainly no guilt. There was only the smug, suffocating confidence of incredibly arrogant people who firmly believed they had already won the war. Wyatt was seated at the far end of the long table. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly. He had carefully styled his hair to look neat, respectable, and entirely innocent. This was the very man who had plunged a paring knife deep into my lung just weeks prior. This was the pathological liar who had violently drained $350,000 from my dead biological father trust fund to completely pay off his illegal sports gambling debts. And yet he sat there, sipping sparkling water, completely relaxed. He offered me a small condescending nod when I took my seat. I was playing the role of the deeply traumatized victim to absolute perfection. He truly believed that the fraudulent restraining order and the closed police report made him legally untouchable. He had no idea that Sarah and I had already moved from the shadows to freeze his parents' financial assets. He did not know the financial cage was already completely locked around them. The court reporter officially swore Wyatt in first. Attorney Vance began gently walking him through the fabricated events of that horrific night. I sat perfectly silently beside Sarah, listening as my stepbrother completely invented a reality where I was the absolute villain of the story. Wyatt spoke in a calm, measured voice. He looked directly at the court reporter with wide, honest eyes and testified that I had a long-documented history of severe mental instability. He claimed I was obsessively jealous of his close relationship with our parents. He swore under oath that I had come home in a blind, violent, drunken rage and cornered him in the kitchen without any provocation. I described with chilling detail how I had grabbed a heavy crystal vase intent on smashing it directly over his head. According to his sworn testimony, I tripped over my own clumsy feet, slipped on spilled water, and fell directly onto the shattered glass. He boldly claimed the deep bloodstains on his hands were from his heroic, desperate attempt to save my life while I bled on the hardwood floor. It took every single ounce of my self-control not to launch myself across that mahogany table and wrap my hands around his throat. He was sitting there wearing a luxury suit, paid for by my stolen inheritance, calmly committing a massive felony. He smiled a sad, broken smile at his attorney, acting as though reliving the trauma of that night was almost too much for his gentle soul to bear. Sarah sat perfectly still beside me, writing small, precise notes on her yellow legal pad. She did not interrupt him once. She let him build his fragile mountain of lies higher and higher into the sky. Then it was my mother's turn to speak. Susan took the official oath with a delicately trembling hand. If there were Academy Awards given for legal depositions, my mother would have completely swept every single category that afternoon. She wore a modest, conservative floral dress that was completely different from the flashy designer outfits she usually paraded around our neighborhood in her stolen luxury vehicle. She gripped a white tissue in her perfectly manicured hands and began to weep the exact moment Vance asked her to describe my general behavior over the past few months. Susan looked at the lawyers with wide, terrified eyes. She testified that she had lived in absolute silent fear of me for years. She claimed that my immense financial support of their household was actually a twisted, deeply sick form of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. She told the room full of legal professionals that I used my money to control them, to force them to let me live in their home, and to constantly terrorize poor Wyatt. The absolute sheer audacity of her words literally took my breath away. I had drained my own hard-earned savings to pay their mortgage, to keep a solid roof over their heads, and she was sitting under oath, twisting my desperate, pathetic need for her maternal love into a psychotic, dangerous obsession. Her fake tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she dramatically recounted the night of the stabbing. She cried out loudly, describing the terrifying sound of the breaking glass. She swore that she ran downstairs in her robe and found Wyatt desperately trying to stop my bleeding while I screamed horrible, violent threats at them both from the floor. She looked directly at me, then her eyes filled with manufactured terror. She begged Sarah to understand that they only filed the emergency restraining order because they truly believed I would come back and violently murder them all in their sleep. She called me a dangerous monster. She called me deeply disturbed. She said I was completely detached from reality and a severe threat to society. Robert sat faithfully beside her, holding her hand and playing the role of the strong, supportive husband. He nodded along with every single vicious lie she told. He quickly confirmed her entire story when it was his turn to speak. He swore under oath that he had never seen me act so incredibly violent. They formed a unified, impenetrable wall of deception. They felt completely invincible in that room. They thought their combined emotional testimonies would permanently destroy my character and ensure I could never reclaim my stolen money or return to my home. They assumed I was just a broken, discarded son who had absolutely no evidence and no voice left to fight back. The deposition room felt incredibly thick with their toxic arrogance. They had spent 3 agonizing hours thoroughly assassinating my character and painting themselves as the ultimate innocent victims of a madman. Wyatt openly smirked at me when the lawyers briefly paused to review their documents. Susan dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with her crumpled tissue, looking incredibly satisfied with her masterful performance. They had confidently handed Sarah Jenkins every single piece of legal rope she needed to end their lives. They had committed grand perjury on the official legal record with absolute pride. They were incredibly proud of the beautiful, destructive lie they had just sworn to as the absolute truth. They had absolutely no idea what was quietly waiting for them inside Sarah's dark leather briefcase. Sarah Jenkins adjusted her reading glasses and pulled a fresh legal pad from her briefcase. It was finally her turn to ask the questions. Opposing counsel Vance leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms with a look of supreme boredom. He clearly believed this was merely a formality. I thought Sarah was just going to go through the motions before officially surrendering to their overwhelmingly fabricated evidence. My mother, Susan, subtly adjusted her floral dress and dabbed at her dry eyes, ready to continue her award-winning performance. Robert patted her hand reassuringly. Wyatt stared at me from across the mahogany table, a tiny self-satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. They were completely drunk on their own arrogance. They truly believed they had completely outsmarted us. They had absolutely no idea that Sarah and I had spent the last 48 hours meticulously preparing for this exact moment. We did not want to confront them with our evidence yet. We did not want to show our hand or put them on the defensive. Sarah's strategy was entirely psychological. She was going to use their incredible arrogance against them. She was going to ask broad, open-ended questions, giving them all the space they needed to dig their own graves as deep as possible. We needed them to commit to their lies so thoroughly and so officially that they could never walk them back. Sarah started with my mother. She spoke in a remarkably soft, sympathetic voice, completely masking the absolute predator lurking just beneath the surface. "Mrs. Myers," Sarah said gently, looking at Susan with feigned compassion. "I know recounting this trauma is difficult, but for the official record, could you please clarify the exact sequence of physical events that led to Caleb's injuries?" Susan sat up a little straighter, taking a deep, shaky breath to properly set the stage. She looked directly at the court reporter, who was quietly typing every single word into the official legal transcript. Susan swore under the strict penalty of perjury that there was absolutely no weapon involved in the altercation. She confidently testified that Wyatt never held a knife. She explicitly stated that I was entirely out of control, violently swinging my arms, and that I simply lost my footing on the slick kitchen floor. According to her sworn statement, I pitched forward and landed directly on the shattered remains of the heavy crystal vase. Sarah nodded slowly, writing a single note on her yellow pad. "And just to be absolutely clear, Mrs. Myers," Sarah asked, her tone perfectly neutral, "your stepson Wyatt did not stab Caleb." Susan let out a dramatic gasp of horror. "Absolutely not," she cried out, pressing her tissue to her chest. "Wyatt was only trying to catch him. Wyatt is a gentle boy. He would never hurt anyone. He was just trying to save his brother." Sarah turned her gaze to Wyatt. "And you confirm this version of events, Wyatt?" she asked. Wyatt nodded his head, looking incredibly solemn and deeply traumatized. "I swear to it," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I never touched a weapon. I only wanted to help him. I was so incredibly scared." I sat perfectly still next to Sarah, staring at the people who were supposed to be my family. The physical pain from my fresh stitches burned with every shallow breath I took, but I forced myself to remain completely expressionless. They were doing exactly what we needed them to do. Then Sarah seamlessly shifted her line of questioning. She flipped a single page on her notepad and casually brought up the topic of our family finances. She acted as though it was just standard background information to establish my supposed motivations. Now, regarding the family trust fund, established by Caleb's late biological father, Sarah, began, her voice light and conversational. "Have there been any significant withdrawals in the past 8 months?" For a fraction of a second, the arrogant facade in the room slipped. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. Wyatt swallowed hard, his eyes darting quickly toward his attorney. But their immense greed quickly overpowered their brief moment of panic. They assumed we were just fishing for information. They thought we were completely locked out of the accounts and had absolutely no way of accessing the actual bank records. "No," Robert answered firmly, clearing his throat to regain his composure. "That trust has not been touched. It is fully intact, exactly as it has always been." Sarah looked at him, raising one eyebrow in mild curiosity. So you are swearing under oath that neither you, your wife, nor Wyatt have withdrawn any funds from Caleb's inheritance. Robert glared at her, his chest puffing out with manufactured indignation. I swear to it, he stated aggressively. We do not need his money. My contracting business is thriving. We are financially independent. Sarah did not miss a single beat. She immediately turned back to Susan. And Mrs. Myers, she asked sweetly, you recently purchased a brand new luxury sports utility vehicle, correct? Did any funds from Caleb Trust contribute to that purchase? Susan let out a sharp, offended laugh. Her eyes flashed with pure maternal outrage. Of course not, she snapped, sitting up tall and glaring at Sarah. My husband bought that car for me with his own hard-earned business profits. Caleb is delusional if he thinks otherwise. He's just bitterly jealous of our financial success. He has always been deeply resentful of us. Sarah wrote another quick note on her legal pad. Finally, she moved to lock in the absolute core of their deception. She asked them to officially characterize my mental state and my role in the incident. One by one, my mother, my stepfather, and my stepbrother swore under oath that I was the sole unprovoked attacker. They testified that I had completely lost my grip on reality. They stated for the permanent legal record that their fraudulent restraining order was absolutely necessary because I was a psychotic, violent threat to their peaceful existence. They painted me as a monster and they signed their names to the masterpiece. Throughout the entire agonizing process, the court reporter fingers flew across the specialized keyboard. Click, clack, click. Every single vicious lie, every fabricated detail, every arrogant denial of the stolen money and the bloody knife was permanently cemented into a binding legal document. They could not claim a misunderstanding later. They could not say they misspoke or were confused by the questions. They had confidently, passionately, and repeatedly lied to a federal court. When the deposition finally concluded after several exhausting hours, opposing counsel, Vance snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, self-satisfied click. He offered Sarah a patronizing smile, clearly believing he had completely destroyed our case. Susan, Robert, and Wyatt stood up from the mahogany table, looking incredibly relieved and absolutely triumphant. They had survived the questioning without a single scratch. They walked out of that glass-walled conference room, believing they were walking back to their stolen wealth and their perfect suburban lives. Sarah and I remained seated at the table, listening to their footsteps fade down the carpeted hallway. Sarah slowly, carefully set her pen down on the yellow legal pad. She turned to look at me, and the expression on her face sent a shiver of absolute anticipation down my spine. The sympathetic, questioning lawyer was completely gone. The predator had officially returned. We have them, Caleb, she whispered, her voice incredibly cold and sharp. They just committed perjury on every single material fact of this case. They lied about the stabbing, they lied about the trust fund, and they lied about the car. It is all permanently on the record. I looked down at my own notes, the timeline of the attack, and the exact sequence of their financial fraud perfectly matching the physical evidence waiting in Sarah's leather briefcase. The trap had not just closed. It had completely, violently snapped shut right over their arrogant necks. They thought they had buried me, but they had actually just handed us the shovel to dig their own graves. The time for waiting was over. It was finally time to unleash absolute justice. The morning of the trial arrived with a heavy gray overcast that felt entirely appropriate for the brutal reckoning that was about to unfold. I stood outside the imposing stone columns of the Multnomah County Courthouse, taking a slow, careful breath of the damp Portland air. The sharp, stabbing pain in my right side had dulled to a deep, persistent ache, but every single breath still served as a physical reminder of the knife my stepbrother had driven into my ribs. I adjusted the lapels of my dark navy suit. It was a completely different feeling from the last time I had faced my family. Back then, I was wearing cheap hospital scrubs, bleeding destitute, and completely homeless. Today, I was an auditor stepping into a federal courtroom, fully armed with the absolute truth. My attorney, Sarah Jenkins, stood beside me on the concrete steps. She was the absolute picture of legal intimidation, wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit and holding a thick leather briefcase that contained the complete destruction of my family. Sarah looked at me with her piercing analytical eyes and asked if I was ready. I did not even have to hesitate. I had spent my entire adult life desperately seeking the approval of a mother who only saw me as a blank check. I had sacrificed my own financial security to save my stepfather and his failing business to keep a solid roof over their heads. I was completely finished being the invisible son. I nodded to Sarah, and together we walked through the heavy glass doors to face the very monsters who had tried to bury me. We took the elevator up to the fourth floor and walked down the long polished hallway toward courtroom number 7. Sarah had already warned me about the presiding official. Judge Harrison was a man absolutely legendary for his uncompromising strictness and his absolute zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theatrics. I was a former federal prosecutor who demanded total decorum and possessed an uncanny ability to see straight through fabricated emotional performances. My mother had managed to fool the emergency magistrate who signed the fraudulent restraining order, but Judge Harrison was an entirely different kind of legal authority. He dealt exclusively in hard documented facts, and Sarah was about to give him an insurmountable mountain of them. We entered the quiet, solemn courtroom and took our seats at the plaintiff table. The room was incredibly heavy, with the smell of lemon polish and old oak. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me, staring straight ahead at the massive wooden bench where the judge would soon sit. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silent room, echoing the incredibly high stakes of the morning. Every single second that passed brought me closer to the moment my family would finally be forced to answer for their horrific crimes. Precisely 15 minutes before the proceedings were scheduled to begin, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. I did not turn my head, but I could hear the familiar sound of their confident, arrogant footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. My mother, Susan, my stepfather, Robert, and my stepbrother, Wyatt, strode down the center aisle, looking completely victorious before the battle had even begun. They were flanked by their highly paid defense attorney, a man who walked with his chest puffed out, entirely confident in his ability to crush an estranged son who supposedly had no money and a documented history of severe mental instability. I watched them out of the corner of my eye as they took their seats at the defense table. They were putting on a spectacular visual show. Wyatt was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, his hair neatly combed, playing the part of the traumatized, innocent victim to absolute perfection. He looked pale and appropriately solemn, but I could see the underlying arrogance radiating from his posture. Robert wore a somber expression, completely projecting the image of an exhausted father who just wanted to protect his family from a dangerous madman. But it was my mother who truly commanded the room. Susan wore an elegant, muted grey dress, clutching a designer handbag that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased with the money she had siphoned from my stolen inheritance. She moved with the incredibly smug satisfaction of a woman who firmly believed she had already won the ultimate victory. They thought my frozen bank accounts and the restraining order had completely paralyzed me. They genuinely believed I was sitting at the plaintiff table, clinging to a desperate, hopeless lawsuit that their expensive lawyer would easily have thrown out within the first hour of the trial. Before taking her seat, Susan handed her expensive coat to Robert and purposefully walked around the back of the defense table. She took a slow, deliberate detour that brought her directly past where I was sitting. Sarah tightened her grip on her pen but remained perfectly still. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to flinch or show even an ounce of the profound anxiety that used to consume me whenever my mother was near. Susan paused, just inches from my chair. She leaned down slightly, acting as though she was merely brushing a piece of invisible lint from her skirt. The scent of her expensive perfume instantly flooded my senses, bringing back decades of painful memories of her cold, calculating rejection. She turned her head slightly toward me, and a malicious, incredibly cruel smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. "Why did you even waste money on a lawyer, Caleb?" she whispered directly into my ear, her voice dripping with absolute venom and unshakable confidence. "No one in this room is going to believe a crazy person." She straightened up, smoothed her dress, and walked away with a slight confident sway to her hips, taking her seat next to Robert. She looked at her attorney and offered a sad, brave smile, completely ready to play the terrified mother. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to jump out of my chair, shout at her, and prove to the entire courtroom that I was exactly the unhinged, violent monster she had sworn I was in her fraudulent police report. But I did not move a single muscle. I did not raise my voice. I did not even look at her. I simply sat there with my hands folded, resting on the polished wooden table. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my entire body. Her incredible arrogance was going to be the exact instrument of her total destruction. She had built a massive house of cards, balancing it entirely on the assumption that my voice had no power and my truth had no proof. Sarah leaned over to me, her eyes shining with absolute predatory anticipation. "Let them enjoy their final few minutes of confidence, Caleb," she whispered quietly. "The higher they climb, the harder they are going to hit the concrete." Just as she spoke those words, the heavy wooden door beside the bench swung open. The bailiff stepped forward and loudly announced the arrival of Judge Harrison, ordering everyone in the room to rise. The quiet anticipation in the courtroom instantly shattered, transforming into the cold, hard reality of the legal system. The trial of my life was officially beginning, and my family had absolutely no idea that they were walking completely blindfolded into an inescapable legal slaughterhouse. The heavy doors of this courtroom clicked shut, and Judge Harrison took his seat behind the elevated bench. The room was silent, as the bailiff instructed us to sit. I folded my hands on the plaintiff table and took a slow breath. Opposing counsel Vance stood up to make his opening statement. He smoothed his expensive suit and walked toward the center of the room with the casual swagger of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. Vance did not hold back. He launched into a brutal assassination of my character. He painted a picture of a deeply disturbed and bitterly jealous outcast who had spent his entire life leeching off his generous family. He confidently described me as an incompetent failure who could not handle the reality of his stepbrother achieving true success. Vance claimed that the thousands of hours I spent doing Robert accounting for free was actually a calculated manipulation to force myself into a family dynamic where I clearly did not belong. I sat perfectly still and listened to him tear my entire existence apart. Vance claimed that I was financially desperate and had entirely fabricated the story of the stolen trust fund to cover my own tracks. He painted me as a greedy, unstable man trying to extort money from his loving parents and innocent stepbrother. My mother, Susan, sat at the defense table nodding softly in agreement with every vicious lie he told. She dabbed her dry eyes, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch. Then it was time for Wyatt to take the witness stand. My stepbrother walked slowly to the front of the room. He wore his tailored charcoal suit and carried himself with an incredible air of quiet dignity. He raised his right hand and swore under the strict penalty of perjury to tell the absolute truth. I watched him settle into the wooden witness chair, looking directly at Judge Harrison with wide, sorrowful eyes. Vance approached the stand and began leading Wyatt through his rehearsed testimony. Wyatt's performance was absolutely flawless. He told the judge he had never touched a single dime of my trust fund. He completely denied the gambling debts and the wire transfers. He swore the forged signatures were my own clumsy attempts to access the money and frame him for the crime. As Vance guided the questioning toward the night of the stabbing, Wyatt managed to produce genuine-looking tears. He let his voice crack perfectly as he described me coming home in a blind, unprovoked rage. He painted himself as a terrified victim who was only trying to defend his parents from my violent rampage. He looked directly at the judge and said that I had slipped on the kitchen floor and fallen onto the broken glass of the crystal vase. He claimed the blood on his hands was from his desperate attempt to save my life while I screamed horrific threats. It was a stunning display of absolute sociopathic manipulation. Wyatt was incredibly convincing. He looked like a good, responsible young man who had been deeply traumatized by a dangerous relative. I could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting. The heavy silence was completely filled with his manufactured sorrow and his toxic deception. I turned my attention to Judge Harrison. Sarah had warned me he was a strict, no-nonsense former federal prosecutor who demanded hard facts. But as Wyatt continued to spin his web of lies, I saw the judge's posture begin to change. Judge Harrison leaned back in his large leather chair and let out a slow, heavy sigh. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He did not look like a man uncovering a massive criminal conspiracy. He looked incredibly annoyed and deeply impatient. Judge Harrison glanced at the clock on the wall and looked back at the defense table. He was clearly treating this entire proceeding as a trivial and exhausting family squabble. To him, this was just another messy situation where two angry brothers were pointing fingers at each other over money and childhood resentments. He saw a wealthy, respectable-looking family on one side and an estranged son sitting quietly on the other. The judge's body language screamed that he wanted this case off his docket as quickly as possible. The tension in the courtroom became completely suffocating. The air felt incredibly thick and heavy, pressing down on my wounded chest. Every time I took a shallow breath, the fresh stitches in my side burned with a sharp, white-hot agony. They were winning. My mother and stepbrother were successfully transforming my attempted murder and my stolen inheritance into a pathetic domestic dispute. They were manipulating the legal system right in front of my eyes, and the judge was actively buying their carefully constructed illusion. Wyatt wiped a single tear from his cheek and looked at me with an arrogant smirk that only I could see. He felt completely invincible sitting up there on the witness stand. He thought he had absolutely buried me under a mountain of emotional lies and perfectly executed perjury. My mother squeezed Robert's hand at the defense table, looking entirely relieved and absolutely triumphant. They genuinely believed the nightmare they had created for me was finally coming to a permanent close. I looked over at Sarah Jenkins. I expected to see a shadow of doubt or a flicker of concern on her face. If the judge dismissed the case based on this emotional testimony, we would lose absolutely everything. But Sarah did not look worried at all. She was sitting incredibly still, writing neat, precise notes on her yellow legal pad. She had let Vance and Wyatt completely control the narrative for the past hour. She had given them all the rope they needed to hang themselves. The suffocating tension in the room did not bother her one bit because she knew exactly what was resting inside her dark leather briefcase. She knew the absolute truth was finally about to emerge. The courtroom air was thick and completely suffocating. Wyatt had just finished wiping his fake tears, and my mother was clutching Robert's hand like a grieving saint. Defense attorney Vance took his seat with a smug nod to Judge Harrison. The judge glanced at the large clock on the oak-paneled wall. He was clearly eager to wrap up what he believed was just a pathetic, predictable family dispute. He looked over at our table and asked if the plaintiff had any cross-examination for the witness. Sarah Jenkins stood up slowly. She did not grab her standard yellow legal pad. She did not ask me for a whispered piece of advice. Instead, she reached down into her dark leather briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavy black 3-ring binder. Sarah walked toward the center of the courtroom with the measured, predatory grace of a lioness circling her trapped prey. The incredibly loud thud of that massive binder hitting the polished wooden podium echoed through the silent room like a cannon blast. Wyatt visibly flinched in the wooden witness chair. My mother's triumphant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Judge Harrison peered over his reading glasses. His previous annoyance was completely replaced by a sudden spark of intense judicial curiosity. Sarah did not start by asking Wyatt about the broken crystal vase. She did not ask him about my supposed violent rampage, my alleged drinking, or the thick blood on his hands. Instead, she opened the heavy binder, flipped to a securely tabbed section, and looked Wyatt dead in the eye. She asked him in a voice so calm it was genuinely terrifying if he was familiar with a specific trust fund account held at First National Bank. Wyatt blinked his arrogant composure, slipping slightly. He stammered, looking desperately toward Vance, and softly claimed he had no idea what she was talking about. Sarah smiled a razor-thin smile. She pulled out a thick stack of bank statements and approached the witness stand, handing a copy to the court clerk and another copy directly to Judge Harrison. She stated for the official record that this was a trust established by my late biological father, an account holding over $400,000, meant exclusively for my future. She then directed Wyatt's attention to page 4, asking him to read the total amount withdrawn over the past 8 months. Wyatt swallowed hard. His voice trembled violently as he read the number out loud. $350,000. Sarah asked him who authorized those massive withdrawals. Wyatt immediately pointed a shaking finger at me, leaning into his microphone. He claimed I must have done it, repeating his earlier lie that I was reckless and completely unstable. Sarah did not miss a single beat. She pulled the next set of certified documents from the binder. They were digital authorization logs and forensic Internet Protocol trace reports. She presented them to the judge, explaining with absolute clarity that every single withdrawal was initiated from an Internet Protocol address registered exclusively to Wyatt's personal cellular device and his laptop computer. She then presented the physical withdrawal slips complete with my forged signature. She placed a report from a certified handwriting expert into evidence proving the loops and pressure points were a complete mismatch for my handwriting, but a perfect absolute match for Wyatt. The color completely drained from Wyatt's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped directly onto a live landmine. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Harrison was no longer looking at the clock. He was leaning forward, his eyes locked intently onto the financial documents Sarah was handing him. Vance jumped up from his chair and shouted a loud objection, claiming this had absolutely nothing to do with the restraining order or the alleged assault. Sarah fired back instantly, her voice ringing out through the room like a bell. She declared it went directly to motive and perjury. Judge Harrison overruled the objection without hesitation and ordered Sarah to proceed. She then systematically traced the stolen money. She rid off the offshore holding accounts, the domestic wire services, and the well-known online sports betting platforms. She exposed Wyatt's massive crippling gambling debts right there in open court. She proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had stolen $350,000 of my inheritance simply to cover his illegal losses. But Sarah saved the most devastating blow for last. She turned away from the trembling stepbrother on the stand and looked directly at the defense table, where my mother and Robert were sitting in frozen absolute terror. Sarah produced a final set of brightly highlighted banking records. She established that the trust required dual notification for massive withdrawals, meaning my mother, as the original custodian, knew exactly what was happening the entire time. Sarah then traced a specific cashier check for $65,000 drawn directly from my stolen funds. She showed the court exactly how it was deposited into Robert and Susan's joint checking account. And then she presented the final fatal receipt. A wire transfer from their joint account for that exact amount, sent directly to a luxury car dealership in downtown Portland. On the exact same day, my mother brought home her brand new luxury sports utility vehicle. The absolute silence in the courtroom was deafening. The perfect, respectable illusion my parents had built over decades was completely shattered into a million pieces. They had sold my entire future and tried to cover up my murder, all to buy a luxury car and protect their precious image. I sat at the plaintiff table watching the profound horror wash over my mother's face. She looked at me, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief, unable to comprehend that the invisible son she had thrown away had just methodically orchestrated her absolute destruction. The trap had entirely snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out. Vance leaped to his feet, shouting over Sarah, his polished composure completely shattered. He waved his hands frantically, demanding that Judge Harrison strike the entire line of questioning from the official record. He argued loudly that financial records had absolutely nothing to do with a request for a protective order. He called Sarah's actions a desperate ambush and a blatant violation of court procedure. But his voice lacked the smug authority it held just 20 minutes ago. It was high-tight and completely desperate. Sarah did not raise her voice to match his. She did not even look at him. She simply stood at the podium, perfectly calm, waiting for the storm to pass. Judge Harrison banged his wooden gavel with a sharp, explosive crack that instantly silenced the room. He glared down at Vance with the cold, unforgiving eyes of a former federal prosecutor. The judge sternly instructed Vance to sit down and remain completely silent unless he had a valid legal objection grounded in reality. The financial motive, the judge declared, was highly relevant to assessing the credibility of the witnesses who had just sworn under oath that they had absolutely no financial disputes with the plaintiff. I turned my gaze away from the lawyers and looked directly at Robert. The confident stepfather, who sat perfectly upright all morning, was literally melting into his expensive chair. A thick layer of sweat beaded across his forehead. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face with violently trembling hands. His crisp collar suddenly looked 2 sizes too small, choking the life out of him. He kept looking wildly between his attorney, my mother, and the heavy black binder on Sarah's podium. The financial cage we had built was shrinking around him by the second. Robert knew exactly what those bank records meant. He knew the federal implications of wire fraud. I had happily coasted along on my mother, manipulative plans for years, perfectly content to let her control the narrative as long as he reaped the financial benefits. But staring directly down the barrel of undeniable documentary evidence, his cowardice was fully exposed. I was shrinking his shoulders, hunching forward, as if he was physically trying to hide from the devastating truth Sarah had just laid bare. Judge Harrison turned his full, terrifying attention back to the documents in front of him. He picked up the heavy stack of bank statements and the forensic timeline Sarah had provided. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the sharp rustle of heavy paper as the judge flipped from page to page. He compared the dates of the massive offshore wire transfers to the exact date of the violent altercation in our kitchen. He traced his finger along the timeline, his brow furrowed in deep, angry concentration. When he looked up, his expression was completely devoid of any judicial patience. He locked eyes with Wyatt, who was sitting frozen in the witness box, looking like a trapped animal. Judge Harrison spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded absolute obedience. He pointed out that the final withdrawal of $65,000 was initiated exactly 4 hours before the police were called to the house for an alleged assault. He noted the funds moved into a joint account precisely as I was being loaded into an ambulance with a punctured lung. I demanded a clear, logical explanation for how a family supposedly terrified for their physical safety had the absolute presence of mind to execute complex financial wire transfers across state lines on the exact same night their son supposedly went on a violent psychotic rampage. The logic of the judge question hung in the air like a guillotine. Wyatt opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at his mother, begging her to save him. Susan could not handle the silence. She could not handle the total loss of control. For her entire life, she had dictated the reality of our family simply by speaking her version of events louder and more confidently than anyone else. She was entirely incapable of accepting that a piece of paper could override her maternal authority. Before Vance could stop her, Susan shot up from her seat at the defense table. Her face was flushed a deep crimson, her eyes wide with absolute fury. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, completely ignoring the judge and the strict rules of the federal court. "That is family money," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "It is family money, and we had every single right to use it. We housed him. We fed him. We put up with his miserable, jealous attitude for years. He owed us that money. He owed it to Wyatt for being such a good, supportive brother. You have no right to judge us for taking what was rightfully ours. We are his family. We are entitled to that compensation." Vance frantically grabbed her arm, hissing at her to sit down, but Susan violently ripped her arm away. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she had just openly confessed to massive financial fraud on the official legal record. She gripped the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white, and desperately tried to salvage the final piece of her fabricated story. She glared up at Judge Harrison, her chest heaving with arrogant defiance. "And he fell on the glass," she shouted, her voice breaking with frantic, hysterical energy. "He slipped and he fell on the glass. That is a fact. We never touched him. He did this to himself to punish us. He is crazy, and you are all completely blind if you believe a single word he says." She stood there, absolutely convinced that her sheer volume would somehow miraculously bend the legal system to her will. She refused to back down even for a single moment, but the trap had already snapped perfectly shut. It was over now. The echoes of my mother screaming completely filled the high-vaulted ceiling of the federal courtroom. She stood there, chest-heaving face flushed a deep, angry red, entirely convinced that her volume and her sheer maternal audacity would magically bend the federal justice system to her will. She truly believed that screaming I had simply fallen onto the broken glass would automatically make it the established truth. Judge Harrison stared down at her from the high wooden bench, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not yell back at her. He did not order the bailiff to restrain her. He simply watched her completely unravel with the cold, analytical eyes of a man who had spent decades sending arrogant criminals to federal prison. The heavy silence that followed her hysterical outburst was completely suffocating. It was the distinct sound of a woman realizing she had just pushed herself entirely over the absolute edge of reason. Robert was pulling frantically on her floral sleeve, desperately trying to force her back into her chair, but Susan stood completely rigid, refusing to yield a single inch. Sarah Jenkins did not flinch at the shouting. She had stood perfectly still at the plaintiff podium, absorbing the absolute brunt of my mother, frantic, desperate rage. When the courtroom was finally entirely quiet again, Sarah slowly reached her hand back into her dark leather briefcase. She did not pull out another stack of printed bank statements. She did not produce another forged withdrawal slip or a complicated forensic internet protocol report. She simply withdrew a small black digital flash drive. She held the tiny plastic rectangle up between her thumb and index finger so that the overhead fluorescent lights caught its smooth surface. It was such a small, incredibly insignificant-looking object. But I knew exactly what was on that drive, and so did Sarah. We had guarded that specific piece of digital evidence for weeks, waiting for the exact perfect moment to completely shatter their carefully constructed reality. Sarah looked directly up at the bench and addressed Judge Harrison in a voice that was perfectly calm and absolutely lethal. She stated clearly for the official record that there seemed to be a significant ongoing dispute regarding the exact physical events that took place in my home on the night of the attack. She pointed out that the defense had sworn under the strict penalty of perjury that I had slipped and violently fallen onto a broken crystal vase in a drunken rage. She noted that my mother and my stepbrother had passionately testified just moments ago that they had never laid a single hand on me. Sarah then held the flash drive slightly higher in the air. She spoke clearly so every single person in the room could hear her. Your Honor, to definitively clarify whether the plaintiff fell or was assassinated to cover up massive financial fraud, we submit this audio recorded at the scene at 1 in the morning on that night. The exact moment the word audio left, Sarah Lips, the entire atmosphere at the defense table violently collapsed. The arrogant, confident posture that had defined my family for my entire life instantly evaporated into thin air. I watched the blood completely drain from my mother's face, leaving her skin looking like absolute chalk. Her mouth hung slightly open, perfectly frozen in a mask of absolute sheer terror. She slowly sank back into her expensive leather chair, completely unable to support her own body weight. Robert began to shake so violently that I could actually hear his knee knocking against the heavy wooden table. But the most spectacular reaction belonged entirely to Wyatt. My stepbrother sat in the wooden witness box, looking like a man who had just been handed a literal death sentence. His eyes went incredibly wide and his chest began to heave with genuine, authentic panic. He suddenly remembered exactly what he had said to me while I was bleeding out on the cold kitchen floor. He remembered his brutal, arrogant confession. Defense attorney Vance completely lost his mind. He leaped up from his chair, knocking it backwards so hard it slammed into the wooden railing separating the gallery from the court. He began shouting wildly, throwing his arms in the air and begging the judge to completely reject the evidence. Vance argued with incredibly desperate, frantic energy that this was an illegal ambush. He claimed the audio was totally inadmissible because it had not been properly submitted during the initial discovery phase of the hearing. He shouted that Oregon was a two-party consent state and that any secret recording was a blatant, massive violation of state and federal privacy laws. I was sweating heavily, entirely aware that if that flash drive was plugged into the court speaker system, his massive, highly lucrative legal defense would be completely annihilated in front of a furious federal judge. Judge Harrison slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with incredible force, demanding total, absolute silence from the defense table. He looked at Vance with an expression of pure, unadulterated judicial disgust. Sarah did not even wait for the judge to ask for her legal justification. She spoke clearly and authoritatively, citing the exact specific legal precedent that applied to our situation. She patiently explained to the court that while the state generally required two-party consent, there was a widely recognized and well-documented absolute legal exception for recordings that capture a violent felony in progress or capture direct evidence of severe extortion and attempted murder. Because my life was in immediate, imminent danger when the recording was made, the audio was completely legally admissible as primary evidence of a violent crime. Furthermore, she pointed out that the defense had explicitly opened the door to this evidence by actively committing profound, undeniable perjury on the witness stand just moments prior. Judge Harrison stared down at the small black flash drive resting on Sarah's podium. He looked back at the defense table, thoroughly observing the completely terrified, sweating faces of my mother, my stepfather, and my stepbrother. He took a long, deliberate moment to let the absolute gravity of the situation fully settle over the room. The judge did not need any more convincing. He firmly and loudly overruled Vance's frantic, desperate objections and officially accepted the digital drive into the permanent legal record. He ordered the court bailiff to take the flash drive from Sarah and plug it directly into the main audio-visual system of the federal courtroom. The bailiff walked slowly across the polished floor, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the completely silent room. Every single eye tracked his movement as he carried the tiny device toward the clerk computer terminal. I sat at the plaintiff table, my hands resting quietly on the polished wood, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of total vindication. For my entire life, my mother had controlled the narrative. She had always used her loud, confident voice to completely silence mine. She had told the entire world that I was a difficult, ungrateful, and mentally unstable son. She had absolutely convinced everyone around her that she was a deeply loving mother, burdened with a terrible, troubled child. but her voice was about to be entirely stripped of all its power. The silence in the courtroom was incredibly heavy, perfectly thick with absolute dread. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, but it could not cool the suffocating heat radiating from the defense table. Vance sank slowly back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, entirely defeated. Robert looked like he was about to physically vomit right there on the pristine courtroom floor. My mother stared at the dark court speakers mounted on the high wooden walls, her eyes completely wide with unimaginable absolute horror. The bailiff clicked the computer mouse, and the digital file began to load on the main screen. The absolute truth was finally about to echo through the sacred halls of justice and completely destroy the monsters who had tried to bury me in the dark. The bailiff clicked the mouse, and the courtroom speakers hummed to life with a low hiss of static. For a brief second, that felt like an absolute eternity. Nobody moved a single muscle. The silence was so profound that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a steady rhythm of anticipation and lingering trauma. I stared directly at the defense table. I wanted to witness every single microsecond of their impending destruction. My mother, Susan, was gripping the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. Wyatt was practically shrinking into his chair, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for a hidden exit. Robert looked physically ill, his face flushed and covered in a thick sheen of cold sweat. They knew they were trapped, but they had absolutely no idea just how deep the trap truly went. Then the audio began to play. It started with the muffled sounds of our kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the sharp clatter of something heavy hitting the countertop. And then came Wyatt's voice. It did not sound like the gentle, traumatized victim he had pretended to be on the witness stand just an hour ago. The voice echoing through the pristine federal courtroom was slurred heavy with alcohol and absolutely dripping with arrogant malice. The recording captured him perfectly. He was practically spitting the words as he cornered me near the island. "Yeah, I took the money. What are you going to do about it?" Wyatt's drunken growl bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom, completely shattering the delicate illusion of innocence he had built. "You think anyone is going to believe you, Caleb? You are a joke. I will kill you to shut you up." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery behind me. Defense attorney Vance physically recoiled, dropping his pen onto the table with a sharp clatter. On the recording, the heavy sound of a sudden violent scuffle broke out. Footsteps slipped violently against the hardwood floor. There was a loud, aggressive grunt from Wyatt, followed immediately by a wet, sickening sound that made my own stomach turn. It was the distinct, terrible sound of a heavy blade sliding deep into flesh. The courtroom was forced to listen to the immediate aftermath. The speakers played my sudden, sharp gasp of sheer agony as the paring knife punctured my lung. The microphone on my hidden phone picked up the heavy thud of my body collapsing onto the kitchen floor. I could hear myself wheezing, desperately struggling to pull oxygen into my damaged lungs. The sound of my own dying breaths filled the silent room. It was incredibly difficult to listen to. It brought back the blinding physical pain and the terrifying psychological realization that my life was slipping away right there in the house I had paid to maintain. I glanced at Judge Harrison. The magistrate's face was entirely rigid, his eyes wide with absolute horror and pure judicial fury. I was gripping his wooden gavel so tightly his hand was visibly shaking. The strict judge, who had been rolling his eyes at a petty family dispute, was now witnessing a brutal, violent felony. But the absolute most damning piece of evidence was yet to come. The recording continued playing my ragged breathing and Wyatt panicked, cursing. Then another set of footsteps rushed into the room. It was my mother. The courtroom heard her sharp intake of breath. For a fraction of a second, anyone listening might have expected a mother to scream for an ambulance or rush to comfort her bleeding child. Instead, the speakers delivered the cold, calculated voice of a complete monster. Robert wiped the handle. Susan's voice was crystal clear, completely devoid of any maternal warmth or panic. It was the commanding tone of a woman who was entirely focused on preserving her perfect image at the absolute cost of her own son's life. Wyatt smashed the vase. "Tell the cops he was drunk. No one cares about a drama queen." The words rang out with devastating clarity. No one cares about a drama queen. She had stood over my bleeding body, watched me fighting for every single breath, and casually ordered her husband and stepson to completely fabricate a crime scene. She had orchestrated my attempted murder cover-up with the exact same emotional detachment she used to organize her neighborhood dinner parties. She did not care if I lived or died. She only cared about keeping the luxury car and the stolen trust fund money securely in her possession. I felt a cold, absolute closure wash over me. The mother I had spent 28 years trying to please simply did not exist. She never had. The audio file ended with a final soft click, and the courtroom plunged into a heavy, dead silence. It was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, absolute vacuum of sound. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to shift in their seats. The sheer magnitude of the pure evil they had just witnessed completely paralyzed every single person in the room. Mirrors. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at the defense table. Susan was completely frozen. She had turned entirely to stone. Her jaw was unhinged, hanging completely slack as her mind desperately tried to process the reality of her total, absolute destruction. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring blankly ahead at the wooden podium where Sarah stood. That cruel, victorious smirk that she had flashed at me just hours ago was dead forever. It had been entirely wiped from her face, replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that her perfect suburban life was entirely over and she was going to federal prison. Robert had buried his face completely in his trembling hands, letting out soft, pathetic whimpers of sheer terror. His broad shoulders shook as the reality of his compliance finally caught up with him. Wyatt was sitting totally rigid in his chair, staring at the floor with wide, unblinking eyes. The fake tears were entirely gone. The confident posture was completely destroyed. They were completely stripped of their lies and exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of the absolute truth. Defense attorney Vance slowly sank back into his leather chair, looking completely sick to his stomach. He did not offer a single objection. He did not speak a single word to defend them. He knew instantly that his clients had not only lied to him, but had actively used him to blindly facilitate a massive perjury scheme in a federal courtroom. He packed his yellow legal pad away, moving with the incredibly slow mechanical motions of a completely defeated man. Judge Harrison slowly took off his reading glasses. The heavy silence stretched on for another agonizing minute before he finally spoke. His voice was incredibly low, trembling with a deep, righteous anger that filled the entire room. He looked down at my family with absolute, utter disgust. The legal trap had not just closed around them, it had completely crushed them. I sat at the plaintiff table feeling the massive heavy weight of endless rejection and financial abuse finally lift permanently off my shoulders. I was no longer the invisible scapegoat son. I was the man who had finally dragged them out of the shadows and forced them into the blinding light of justice. The final metallic click of the audio recording echoed through the massive federal courtroom, leaving behind an absolute and incredibly profound silence. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to take a single breath. The terrible, sickening sound of Wyatt driving that paring knife into my ribs, and my mother casually ordering him to smash the vase hung in the heavy air like a dark cloud of guilt. I kept my eyes completely locked on the high wooden bench. Judge Harrison sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. He slowly raised his hands and removed his wire-rimmed reading glasses. He placed them deliberately on the smooth mahogany surface of his desk. When he finally looked up, his face was entirely transformed. The mild annoyance he had shown earlier was completely gone. In its place was a dark, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He had just been forced to sit and listen while three deeply arrogant people committed massive coordinated perjury to cover up a horrific, violent felony. Judge Harrison leaned forward, and his voice cut through the suffocating silence with the incredibly sharp, lethal precision of a scalpel. He looked directly at the defense table, where my mother Susan, my stepfather Robert, and my stepbrother Wyatt were currently completely frozen in absolute sheer terror. The judge stated for the permanent legal record that in his 30 years of serving on the federal bench, he had never witnessed such a profound, deeply sickening display of pathological deceit and sociopathic behavior. He stated that they had actively attempted to manipulate the justice system to finish the destruction of a man they had already violently tried to execute. Then Judge Harrison turned his dark, furious eyes entirely onto my stepbrother. Wyatt was practically shrinking into his expensive custom-tailored suit, completely unable to maintain eye contact with the furious magistrate. Judge Harrison raised his right hand and pointed a single commanding finger directly at Wyatt. The judge did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He looked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom and immediately signaled the armed bailiffs who were already standing at absolute rigid attention. "Cuff that man." Judge Harrison ordered, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings with incredibly terrifying authority. "Detain Wyatt immediately for attempted murder and aggravated assault." The entire courtroom instantly exploded into absolute chaotic motion. Two large uniformed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, abandoning their posts by the door. Their heavy black boots thudded violently against the polished hardwood floor as they marched directly toward the defense table. The heavy metallic clinking of their utility belts and handcuffs filled the air, replacing the deafening silence with the terrifying, undeniable sounds of severe criminal consequences. Wyatt finally completely broke. The arrogant, smug facade he had worn all morning instantly shattered into a million tiny, irrecoverable pieces. He leaped up from his chair, knocking it backwards so hard it crashed loudly onto the floor. "No," Wyatt screamed, his voice cracking with absolute, sheer, unadulterated panic. "No, you cannot do this. It was a mistake. I did not mean to do it." He was entirely frantic, backing away from the heavy oak table and bumping directly into the wooden railing that separated the defense area from the gallery. He raised his hands in a pathetic, desperate attempt to ward off the approaching officers. He looked wildly around the room, completely abandoning the sophisticated victim narrative he had spent hours building under oath. He was exactly what the audio recording proved him to be, a violent coward, entirely terrified of facing the consequences of his own horrific actions. The bailiffs did not slow down. They reached him in a matter of seconds. One officer grabbed Wyatt by his left shoulder and violently spun him around, slamming him face first directly into the heavy wooden surface of the defense table. Wyatt let out a loud, sharp yelp of pain as his cheek hit the polished mahogany right next to his attorney-expensive leather briefcase. The second officer grabbed Wyatt's right arm and aggressively wrenched it behind his back. The loud, sharp, metallic click of the cold steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Wyatt's wrists echoed through the entire courtroom. It was the most incredibly beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire 28 years of life. My mother jumped to her feet, completely ignoring the explicit orders of the federal judge. She reached her hands out toward Wyatt, screaming his name with absolute hysterical desperation. "You are hurting him," she shrieked, her voice completely raw and ugly. "Get your hands off my son. He is innocent. Caleb made him do it." She actually tried to step around the defense table to physically push the armed bailiff away from her precious golden child. It was a completely insane, deeply pathetic display of maternal delusion. She was entirely willing to fight armed federal officers to protect the son who had stabbed me. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down with such incredible explosive force that the loud crack made my mother physically flinch. He ordered her to sit down immediately and remain completely silent, or she would join her son in a holding cell for contempt of court. He warned her that she was already facing massive federal charges for wire fraud, perjury, and orchestrating the cover-up of a violent felony. Susan froze halfway across the floor. The absolute terrifying reality of the judge's words finally broke through her massive wall of suburban entitlement. She slowly backed away, sinking heavily into her chair and burying her face in her trembling hands. The bailiffs yanked Wyatt roughly to his feet. His expensive charcoal suit was completely rumpled, and his perfectly styled hair was hanging wildly in his eyes. He was sobbing loudly, completely ugly, heavy tears streaming down his flushed face. He looked over his shoulder at our mother, desperately pleading for her to fix the situation, to wave her magic wand and make the consequences entirely disappear, just like she had always done for him. But Susan could not even look at him. She kept her face completely hidden in her hands, paralyzed by her own impending destruction. As the bailiffs forcefully marched Wyatt down the center aisle of the courtroom, he passed directly by the plaintiff table. For one incredibly brief second, our eyes met. There was absolutely no smugness left in his gaze. There was only pure, absolute terror and the devastating realization that I had completely, utterly destroyed him. He opened his mouth to say something, but the bailiff shoved him forward, propelling him completely out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors slammed completely shut behind them, instantly cutting off the sound of his pathetic, desperate sobbing. I sat perfectly still beside Sarah, feeling the incredibly deep, persistent ache in my wounded side slowly fade away, replaced by the immense, profound warmth of absolute, undeniable justice. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slammed shut behind the bailiffs who were dragging Wyatt away to a federal holding cell. The echo of those doors closing felt like a massive iron vault sealing over the darkest chapter of my entire life. I turned my attention back to the front of the room. Judge Harrison was still sitting high up on the wooden bench, looking down at my mother and stepfather with an expression of absolute disgust. The federal magistrate had just witnessed a mother actively attempt to frame her own violently assaulted son in order to protect her precious image and a stolen fortune. He slowly adjusted his robes and leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on the polished mahogany surface. The courtroom was incredibly silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning rattling in the high-ceiling vents. Judge Harrison fixed his dark, piercing eyes directly onto Robert and Susan. He stated for the official legal record that he had presided over countless difficult family disputes during his 30 years on the bench. He noted that he had seen incredibly greedy people lie under oath to secure financial assets, but he declared with absolute chilling certainty that he had never witnessed a mother and a father actively conspire to cover up the attempted murder of their own son. He told them that their actions were not simply a matter of poor judgment or a terrible mistake. He called their behavior profoundly evil and deeply sociopathic. Robert began to shake so violently that his expensive leather chair rattled loudly against the hardwood floor. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out soft, pathetic whimpers of sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew his comfortable suburban life was entirely over. The judge did not stop there. He informed them that their fraudulent petition for a restraining order was officially completely dismissed with extreme prejudice. He then looked directly at the court reporter and instructed her to immediately prepare a full certified transcript of the morning proceedings. Judge Harrison announced that he was personally issuing immediate criminal referrals to the district attorney office, right there on the spot. He listed the incredibly severe charges one by one in a cold, booming voice. He stated they were being officially referred for multiple counts of felony perjury. He added accessory after the fact to attempted murder. High included massive wire fraud and severe evidence tampering. Each individual charge carried a potential sentence of decades in a federal penitentiary. The heavy weight of his words crushed the defense table like a massive concrete block. Defense attorney Vance was already frantically packing his expensive leather briefcase, refusing to even look at his clients. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship. My mother, Susan, was completely frozen in her chair. The incredibly smug, victorious smirk she had worn into the courtroom just a few short hours ago was entirely dead and gone forever. Her perfectly applied, expensive makeup was completely ruined by the heavy sweat forming on her forehead. The arrogant suburban queen who had always controlled every single narrative was finally completely trapped in a reality she could not manipulate. She looked frantically around the large room, desperately searching for a manager to complain to or a sympathetic ear to manipulate. But there was absolutely no one left. She was completely, utterly alone. As the absolute terrifying reality of federal prison finally broke through her massive wall of delusion, Susan completely snapped. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she slid directly out of her expensive leather chair. She hit the polished hardwood floor of the courtroom with a heavy, sickening thud. The woman who had always cared so incredibly much about her perfect public image was completely falling apart in front of judges, lawyers, and armed federal officers. She dropped heavily onto her hands and knees, her expensive floral dress twisting around her legs. She began to crawl across the floor toward the plaintiff table where I was sitting with Sarah Jenkins. Susan was sobbing uncontrollably now. It was not the delicate, manufactured weeping she had used earlier on the witness stand. These were loud, ugly, heaving gasps of absolute sheer panic. She reached her trembling hands out toward my shoes. "Caleb, please," she wailed, her voice echoing horribly off the tall oak walls. "Caleb, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it was a huge mistake. I am so incredibly sorry. I am your mother, Caleb. Please, I am your mother. You cannot let them take me away." She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, desperately pleading for the invisible, discarded son to save her one last time. She expected me to fold. She expected the desperate little boy who had paid her mortgage and craved her love to suddenly reappear and shield her from the consequences of her own horrific actions. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no sadness, and there was certainly no pity. The deep burning pain in my right side, where her golden child had stabbed me, felt completely disconnected from the cold, absolute closure filling my mind. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my chair. I simply looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. "You gave up the right to be my mother the second you wiped that knife clean," I said. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion. Susan let out a sharp, devastated gasp as if I had physically struck her across the face. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing violently. The armed bailiffs moved in, pulling her to her feet and preparing to take her into custody. I turned my back on her, buttoned my navy suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the broken ruins of my former family behind me. The criminal trial had permanently stripped my family of their freedom, but the civil lawsuit was expertly designed to strip them of absolutely everything else. Sarah Jenkins had promised me on the very first day we met that she would not stop fighting until my mother and stepfather were left with absolutely nothing. She delivered on that solemn promise with a level of terrifying legal precision that left the entire courtroom completely speechless. The civil magistrate did not just rule quietly in our favor. He brought down the heavy iron hammer of absolute financial ruin directly upon Susan and Robert. The final ruling was a complete and total victory for the truth. The judge ordered them to immediately repay the stolen $350,000 to my trust fund. But that was only the very beginning of their financial nightmare, because of the deeply malicious nature of their fraud and the incredibly violent cover-up. The judge aggressively added massive punitive damages to the final judgment. He also strictly ordered them to pay every single cent of my extensive legal fees and awarded a substantial sum for the severe emotional distress and the horrific physical trauma I had endured on their kitchen floor. The final judgment against them totaled over $800,000. Robert and Susan did not have $800,000. They had spent their entire adult lives desperately projecting the false image of incredible wealth while quietly drowning in mounting debt and relying entirely on my hard-earned money to simply keep their heads above water. With the federal injunction already firmly in place, they had absolutely no way to hide what little money they actually still possessed. The court ordered an immediate and total liquidation of all their financial assets. I sat in Sarah's quiet office and watched the official bank statements roll in as the court systematically drained their accounts dry. Robert's business checking account was completely emptied overnight. His supposed thriving contracting company collapsed into total absolute bankruptcy within 48 hours. He had built his entire career on loud boasting and empty promises, but the court seized his work trucks, his tools, and his corporate accounts without a single ounce of mercy. Every single personal savings account, every hidden emergency fund, and every hidden line of credit was swiftly seized by the federal government and redirected into a secure escrow account in my name. They were financially completely annihilated in the blink of an eye. But the absolute most devastating blow to my mother, incredible pride, was yet to come, because the remaining liquid assets did not even come close to covering the massive civil judgment. The court placed an aggressive legal lien on their precious suburban house. This was the exact same house where I had lived as an invisible ghost for years. The house where I had foolishly sacrificed my own youth and blindly drained my own personal savings just to pay their mortgage every single month. The house where my mother had happily watched me bleed on the kitchen floor and coldly ordered my stepbrother to wipe his fingerprints off the knife. The bank initiated immediate brutal foreclosure proceedings. Susan and Robert were officially served with a mandatory eviction notice by the county sheriff. They were legally ordered to completely vacate the premises within 30 days. For a woman who had aggressively built her entire identity around her pristine neighborhood reputation and her perfectly manicured lawn, the cold reality of being publicly evicted was a fate far worse than death itself. On the crisp morning of their final eviction, I quietly parked my car across the street from the property. I did not go there to gloat or to scream at them. I went there to silently witness the absolute end of my lifelong invisible prison. I watched silently from behind my steering wheel as the county sheriff deputies arrived with heavy boots and stern faces to enforce the court order. My mother slowly walked out of the front door, wearing cheap baggy sweatpants and a faded gray sweater looking completely unrecognizable. There was no expensive designer handbag clutched in her hands. There was no bright victorious smirk on her face. There was no luxury sports utility vehicle waiting for her in the driveway. The bank had already forcefully repossessed the expensive vehicle they had bought with my stolen inheritance. Robert trudged miserably behind her, carrying 2 cheap black plastic trash bags filled with whatever basic clothes they were legally allowed to take with them. He looked like a completely broken, defeated old man. They stood on the cold public sidewalk, staring blankly at the locked front door of the large, beautiful house they used to proudly claim as their own exclusive kingdom. Their bank accounts were completely, totally empty. Their credit was permanently destroyed beyond any hope of repair. They had absolutely nowhere to go and absolutely no one left to emotionally manipulate. The wealthy neighbors they had tried so desperately to impress for decades simply pulled their heavy curtains shut and completely ignored them, standing shivering on the sidewalk. They were finally experiencing the exact same profound abandonment and cold rejection they had forced upon me for my entire life. I watched them shiver in the morning air for a few more minutes before I slowly put my car in gear. I drove away from that dark house for the very last time, feeling the warm, bright morning sun on my face. I knew my new life was just beginning. The financial cage had permanently locked them out in the cold, unforgiving world, and I was finally entirely free to build a beautiful future entirely of my own. The criminal sentencing took place exactly 3 months after the civil trial. Left my family completely bankrupt. I walked into the county courthouse on a rainy Tuesday morning feeling an incredible sense of absolute calm. The sterile smell of the courthouse hallways felt remarkably different this time. I was no longer the frightened victim bleeding on a kitchen floor. I was the primary witness for the prosecution in a massive criminal case. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, right directly behind the prosecutors. The heavy wooden door on the side of the courtroom opened, and the bailiffs led Wyatt into the room. He was not wearing his expensive custom-tailored suits anymore. I was shuffling forward in a bright orange county jail jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles secured in heavy steel chains. He looked incredibly small, completely pale, and entirely terrified. He had spent the last 90 days sitting in a concrete cell, realizing that his arrogant, drunken actions had permanently destroyed his entire future. The presiding criminal court judge was a stern woman with absolutely no patience for wealthy suburban criminals. She looked down at Wyatt with a cold, penetrating stare that made him physically shrink into his chair. When she read his sentence, her voice echoed through the completely silent room like the striking of a massive iron bell. For the incredibly severe crimes of first-degree assault and grand larceny, she sentenced my stepbrother to 15 years in the state penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Wyatt let out a loud, guttural sob that bounced off the high walls. He begged the judge for mercy, crying that he was young and had made a terrible mistake. But the judge quickly silenced him. She firmly stated that plunging a knife into his brother's chest and stealing $350,000 was not a simple mistake. It was a calculated, vicious felony. The bailiffs immediately hauled Wyatt away as he wept uncontrollably, his heavy chains clanking loudly all the way down the long hallway. Then it was time for Robert and Susan to face their own absolute nightmare. My mother and stepfather were brought into the courtroom next. Susan looked completely unrecognizable. Without her expensive salon treatments, her manicured nails, and her designer clothes, she just looked like a deeply tired, bitter old woman. Robert was slouched forward, his face completely hollow and defeated. They stood before the judge, trembling violently as the charges were read aloud for the official public record. The judge stared down at them and declared that their actions were among the most deeply disturbing she had ever witnessed. She noted that instead of seeking medical help for their dying son, they had actively orchestrated a sophisticated cover-up to protect their stolen wealth and their precious public image. The judge did not offer them a single ounce of leniency for the crimes of profound obstruction of justice and severe felony perjury. She sentenced both Robert and Susan to 3 full years in federal prison. Susan's legs instantly gave out. She dropped directly to her knees on the hard courtroom floor, sobbing and begging hysterically. She looked up at me, her face a twisted mask of absolute panic, and she cried out that she was so incredibly sorry, and that she was my mother. I looked down at her as she wept on the ground. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion as I spoke my final words to her. I told her that she gave up the absolute right to be my mother the exact second she wiped that bloody knife clean. I did not move a single muscle as the bailiffs pulled her to her feet and the cold, heavy handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists. The woman who had treated me like an absolute burden, my entire life, was finally being hauled away to a tiny concrete cell where she truly belonged. But the absolute final destruction of my mother came the very next morning. Susan had spent her entire adult life aggressively obsessing over her pristine suburban reputation. She had attended every single Sunday service at our local church, playing the role of the perfect devoted Christian mother. She had hosted incredibly lavish neighborhood dinner parties, proudly showing off her beautiful home and her supposedly perfect family. She derived all of her self-worth from what the wealthy country club set thought of her. The morning after the sentencing, the local newspaper completely shredded that carefully fabricated illusion into a million tiny pieces. The headline was printed in massive bold black letters right on the very front page. It read that prominent suburban parents were sentenced to prison for covering up the brutal stabbing of their son to hide a massive trust fund theft. The incredibly detailed article laid out every single horrifying fact of the case. It described the stolen $350,000. It described the luxury sports utility vehicle they had selfishly purchased with my money. And it detailed the exact horrific audio recording where Susan coldly ordered Wyatt to wipe his fingerprints off the bloody knife while I was gasping for air on the floor. The community reaction was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. The church congregation that Susan had proudly led for years was completely horrified. The pastor publicly condemned their actions, and their names were permanently stricken from every single committee and social registry in the entire town. The wealthy neighbors who used to attend their lavish parties completely abandoned them. The social ruin was absolute and total. They went from being the most respected family in our affluent suburb to being the absolute disgrace of the entire state. Their perfect, pristine facade was entirely burned to the ground, leaving absolutely nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth for the entire world to see. I walked out of my new apartment that morning and bought a copy of the local newspaper. I sat on a quiet park bench and read the article from beginning to end while drinking a warm cup of coffee. The heavy toxic burden that I had carried on my shoulders for 28 years was finally permanently lifted. I had survived their emotional abuse. I had survived their financial betrayal, and I had survived their violent attempt to silence me forever. The monsters who had kept me locked in an invisible prison of guilt and obligation were now securely locked in actual physical cages of iron and concrete. I threw the newspaper into the trash can, took a deep breath of fresh morning air, and smiled. The nightmare was finally completely over, and my beautiful free life was just beginning. I want to take a moment to ask all of you watching something incredibly important. Have you ever had to find the absolute courage to cut off toxic people who only wanted to use you and break you down? Please tell me your story in the comments below, because I truly want to read every single one of them. Boundaries are not a betrayal of your family. They are the ultimate protection of your own beautiful soul. If this story resonated with you and brought you some comfort today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another video. And before you go, drop a comment telling me exactly where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I absolutely love connecting with this amazing community. Always remember that your worth is never defined by the people who failed to love you properly. Thank you so much for watching, and please take care of yourself today. It has been exactly 1 entire year since the federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel and sent my mother and stepbrother away to prison. A full entire year since the heavy doors of the courtroom closed forever on the darkest, most painful chapter of my entire life. Today I woke up in my new home, and for the first time in as long as I can possibly remember, the house was completely and utterly quiet. There was absolutely no shouting coming from the hallway. There was no cruel manipulation waiting for me in the kitchen. There was no dark underlying dread settling heavily in my stomach the exact moment my feet touched the floor. I walked slowly into my bright bathroom and looked deeply at my reflection in the mirror. I took off my shirt and ran my fingers gently over the pale, jagged scar on my right side. It is the only physical reminder left of the terrible night my stepbrother tried to take my life, and my mother coldly tried to erase my existence forever. The skin is fully healed now. The deep, terrifying ache in my lungs that used to keep me awake every single night has completely vanished. But the physical healing was always the easy part of the journey. The mental healing was the massive, impossible mountain I had to climb every single day just to survive. For the first few difficult months after the massive trial, I still woke up shivering in cold sweats. I kept expecting the police to knock on my door. I kept expecting to find my mother standing on my front porch with that cold, terrifying smirk on her face. But those dark nightmares slowly lost their incredible power over me. Sarah Jenkins, my incredible attorney, helped me find a wonderful therapist who specializes entirely in severe family trauma. Through those incredibly long weekly sessions, I slowly learned how to untangle the deep, dark web of guilt my mother had spent decades weaving around my vulnerable mind. I finally learned that I was absolutely not responsible for the horrific crimes of the greedy people who simply happened to share my blood. Today, I am a completely different and entirely free man. I took the successfully recovered trust fund money and the massive settlement from the civil lawsuit, and I did exactly what my biological father originally intended for me to do. I built a beautiful, secure future. 4 months ago, I confidently signed the lease on a beautiful historic brick building in downtown Portland and officially opened my own independent accounting firm. I proudly named it Myers and Associates. I completely dropped the last name of my stepfather forever. I fully reclaimed my own true identity. The accounting firm has been incredibly successful right from the very first day we opened the doors. People in the local community read the detailed newspaper articles about the dramatic trial. They saw exactly how meticulously I had tracked the stolen funds and how perfectly I had organized the complex financial evidence that ultimately took down a criminal family conspiracy. They knew that if I could untangle the massive web of offshore accounts and hidden wire transfers created by my mother, I could easily and safely manage their corporate taxes and their small business ledgers. My new office is always filled with bright, warm, natural sunlight. My large desk is made of solid, beautiful oak. Every single client who walks through my heavy glass doors greets me with genuine professional respect. I do not ever have to beg for their basic approval. I do not ever have to buy their fake affection. I simply provide an honest, incredibly valuable service, and I am compensated fairly and respectfully for my hard work. It is a simple, beautifully honest life, and it is absolutely wonderful. Every single day I walk into my beautiful office, I am reminded of how far I have come. I see the framed accounting degrees on my wall, and I know I earned every single one of them with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I look at my staff, and I treat them with the exact kindness and respect I was completely denied as a child. We have built a workplace that feels like a true family. We support each other, we celebrate our victories, and we navigate our challenges completely together without any toxic manipulation. It is the exact opposite of the dark, miserable house I grew up in. I finally realized that success is not just about making money. True success is about sleeping peacefully at night, knowing you have never intentionally harmed another human being for your own selfish gain. People often ask me if I'm secretly consumed by dark anger. They assume that because my own mother and stepbrother are sitting in cold concrete prison cells, I must carry a massive, heavy burden of bitter resentment. They wonder how I can possibly sleep at night, knowing my former family is completely ruined and living in total poverty. The absolute truth is, I do not feel any bitterness at all anymore. I learned a very long time ago that holding on to deep resentment is exactly like drinking toxic poison and patiently waiting for the other person to die. Anger takes a massive amount of precious energy. It requires you to constantly feed the destructive fire of the past. I simply refuse to give my mother one more single ounce of my precious energy. She stole my innocent childhood. She stole my hard-earned savings. She violently tried to steal my life. I will absolutely not let her steal my bright future from behind the cold iron bars of a federal penitentiary. I have entirely let them go. They are nothing but distant, forgotten strangers to me now. My mother and stepbrother will spend the next several years sleeping on thin, uncomfortable mattresses in tiny, locked cells. They will have a massive amount of empty time to deeply reflect on the terrible choices they made. I truly hope they find some form of peace, but I will not be the one to give it to them. My responsibility to them ended the very moment I walked out of that federal courtroom. This entire horrific ordeal taught me the absolute most valuable lesson a person can ever possibly learn about human relationships. I learned that family is absolutely not defined by biology. Blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent access pass to your life. True family is defined entirely by mutual respect, by shared trust, and by absolute unconditional support. Family consists of the brave people who rush to your side when you are bleeding on the floor, not the cruel people who casually order someone to wipe the fingerprints off the weapon. Family is Sarah Jenkins standing fiercely by my side in that federal courtroom. Family is the incredibly kind neighbors who brought me warm, healing meals while I was recovering from lung surgery. Family is the beautiful community of true friends I have built, who genuinely celebrate my success instead of secretly plotting to steal it. If the people who gave you life try to violently destroy that life, you have every single moral and legal right to permanently sever the tie. You have the absolute right to walk away forever. You do not ever owe toxic people your blind loyalty just because they happen to share your genetic code. You do not owe your abusers a comfortable seat at your dinner table. Severing that toxic tie was the most difficult, terrifying thing I have ever done, but it was also the golden key that unlocked my entire beautiful life. I walked out of that courtroom a completely free man, and I have spent every single day since then building a wonderful, peaceful life entirely on my own terms. My accounting firm is thriving beyond my wildest dreams. My physical health is absolutely perfect. My mind is finally clear and entirely at peace. I rose directly from the dark ashes of their immense greed, and I built an absolute empire of honesty. I want to take a moment to talk directly to you reading or listening to my story right now. So many of us are deeply conditioned from birth to blindly forgive our families, no matter what horrific, cruel things they do to us. Society constantly tells us that we must turn the other cheek, that we must keep the peace, and that we must always blindly forgive and forget. But I am here to tell you today that this is an incredibly dangerous and deeply toxic lie. Forgiveness is a beautiful and healing concept, but it is wildly misunderstood by so many people. Forgiveness absolutely does not mean letting dangerous, abusive people back into your private life. You can completely forgive someone for your own emotional peace so that you do not have to carry the heavy, toxic weight of boiling anger in your heart. You can forgive them from a massive, safe distance. Forgiveness simply means accepting that the past cannot be changed. It means putting down the heavy, exhausting burden of hoping for a better yesterday. But it absolutely does not mean you have to unlock your front door and invite the monster back into your living room. You can fully forgive someone and still aggressively refuse to ever speak to them again. Boundaries are what truly protect your self-worth. Boundaries are the massive, impenetrable steel walls you build around your peace of mind. Without strong, firm boundaries, you're simply an open target for every greedy, manipulative person who crosses your path. My mother relied entirely on my complete lack of boundaries. She carefully groomed me to accept endless emotional and financial abuse by simply calling it family duty. She taught me that setting a boundary was incredibly selfish and completely unacceptable. But setting a boundary is actually the absolute highest form of personal self-respect. It is you looking directly in the mirror and firmly deciding that you are finally worth protecting. If you have ever been terribly betrayed or dragged through the mud by the exact people who were supposed to love and protect you, I want you to listen to me very carefully right now. You are not crazy. You are not broken. You are not responsible for the evil, devastating things other people choose to do to you. When you are standing completely alone in the dark, surrounded by the horrible lies and the massive psychological manipulation, it can feel like you are completely losing your mind. It can feel like the entire world believes the terrible lies they tell about you. My mother was an absolute master at wearing a pristine, perfect mask for the public while actively hiding a completely rotten and abusive soul. I spent decades truly thinking nobody would ever believe my truth. I thought her massive lies were simply too powerful to ever defeat. But please remember this one absolute truth. The truth always finds a magical way to step into the blinding light. Lies require a massive amount of exhausting, desperate energy to maintain. They require constant covering up, constant careful manipulation, and constant paralyzing fear. The truth is incredibly simple and beautifully pure. It does not need to be remembered because it simply is what actually happened. All you have to do is survive long enough to speak your truth out loud. You are so much stronger than you think you are. You have successfully survived every single terrible day of your life so far. You have survived the cruel gaslighting, the devastating emotional blackmail, and the horrific financial abuse. You survived because you have a beautiful, bright light inside you that toxic, miserable people can never extinguish, no matter how hard they desperately try. They attack you because they are incredibly jealous of that bright light. They want to violently tear you down because your pure integrity highlights their complete, absolute lack of basic human character. Never let them dim your beautiful light. Never apologize for demanding basic human respect, and never ever be afraid to completely walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. Your life belongs entirely to you. Your hard-earned money belongs entirely to you. Your precious peace of mind belongs entirely to you. Guard it fiercely with your entire life. Protect your beautiful future from the miserable people who only want to violently drag you back into their dark, toxic past. I want to remind you that your beautiful future is a completely blank canvas. You hold the pen, and you are the only one who gets to write the next incredible chapter. Do not ever let toxic family members hold the pen for you. Do not let them dictate your worth, your happiness, or your ultimate destination. You have the absolute power to completely rewrite your story, starting right this exact second. It takes immense bravery to stand up and say that you have finally had enough. But I promise you with every single fiber of my being that the absolute freedom waiting for you on the other side of that difficult choice is completely beyond your wildest dreams. You will finally learn how to breathe again. You will finally learn how to smile without waiting for the other shoe to drop. You will finally experience the incredible joy of living a life that is entirely authentically yours. Please do not ever give up on yourself. Keep pushing forward, keep setting those hard boundaries, and keep walking directly toward the beautiful, bright light of your own amazing future. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my long story today. It was incredibly difficult and deeply painful to share these incredibly dark moments, but I know there are thousands of wonderful people out there currently walking through the exact same terrifying nightmare. If sharing my personal journey helps even one single person find the incredible courage to pack their bags and walk away from a toxic, abusive family, then reliving the pain was completely and entirely worth it. If you truly believe in the power of karma, and if you deeply believe that absolute justice always perfectly prevails, in the end, please hit that like button right now. Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow this absolutely amazing community of strong, resilient survivors. We are building a massive, beautiful family here of people who truly understand what it means to completely start over and finally win. I want to hear from every single one of you out there. Have you ever had to set incredibly hard boundaries with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to bravely walk away from the very people who raised you? Please drop a comment below and bravely share your personal story. I read every single comment, and your personal story might be the exact specific thing someone else desperately needs to hear today to find their own incredible courage. We heal by bravely sharing our truth together. Also, please let me know exactly where in the beautiful world you are watching from today and what exact time it is right now where you are. It absolutely amazes me how incredibly far these stories reach and how deeply connected we all really are. Stay incredibly strong, keep your personal boundaries absolutely firm, and never ever forget your true incredible worth. I will see you all in the very next video.